We welcome you here this morning, and I will introduce our speaker, Christina Estes-Werther, who will be giving the presentation today. Christina is an attorney at Pierce Coleman, PLLC. Christina's public law practice includes matters involving open meeting law, conflict of interest, public records, land use, government contracts, and state legislation. As a former state election director for the state of Arizona and a current certified election officer, Christina has extensive experience in election law, including campaign finance and election administration. Christina served as the general counsel for the League of Arizona Cities and Towns for 6 years. So she was with us for 6 years, and we did this training when she was our general counsel. And she also served 8 years of state government at the state Senate, the governor's office, and the Secretary of State's office. She graduated from the University of Arizona with a bachelor's degree in family studies and human development and earned her JD from Gonzaga University School of Law in Spokane, Washington. And so obviously, as you can tell from this bio, Christina is very well versed in election law, and we still rely on her greatly for this. So we really appreciate her doing this today. This session will be, Christina will give an overview and she'll take questions at certain times. So if you have questions, please put those questions in the Q&A that you'll see either at the top of your screen and something will come down, or it should be at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A. Please put your questions there. And then at certain times, Christina will take those questions and we'll read through that list of questions. If there are so many questions that we go over today, we're planning to go for 2 hours. Christina will stay a little bit longer and answer those questions. And then if there's any questions that you have after this, you can always email me at the League or the League in general, the email that went out to you, your questions, and we'll send those to Christina and she can help you to beyond this. So with that, we'll get started. And Christina, thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here back at the League building and doing this training again for you. And I did want to thank you because I know that carving out 2 hours of your day to spend with campaign finance is a sacrifice. So I appreciate that you're interested and willing to learn more about this subject matter, either as a candidate, because this is maybe your first time running, or maybe you're just looking for a refresher, or also maybe because of, you're a clerk and you're just, again, wanting a refresher or some additional information. I did want to say before we kind of jump in that this training is designed for municipal candidates. So it's fine that clerks are on board. And I think we even have a couple of attorneys. I think that's great. The information is valuable for you, but all of this is sort of designed for the candidates as the audience. So I just wanted to share that before we get started. Go ahead, next slide. You can do one more. There you go. Okay, so for the introduction here, we need to go over just some particulars. Of course, I have to give you the standard disclaimer, right? So we're doing a training today, and I am an attorney and I represent cities and towns, but I am not your attorney. And so this training is not creating any sort of attorney-client relationship. This is really just providing you with some general resource information to help you with campaign finance. Also, I wanted to chat a bit about kind of why we're here, and I think why campaign finance is somewhat complicated right now. So in 2016, the state legislature repealed all of the existing campaign finance laws. So usually the state legislature tends to amend laws. So they just go into an existing statute and then they amend certain portions of it, and that existing statute remains. However, what they did here is they actually essentially cut away the entire campaign finance statutes, and then they rewrote them. And so since that time, all of the case law, the court decisions, all the guidance from Attorney General, anything like that also sort of went away. And the first time that this was in effect was for the 2018 election cycle, which means we're really only starting to use this again. This is the third election cycle. So even though, people might ask, why don't we have sort of more information or more guidance, that's the reason, right? We're kind of lacking in that because we had to sort of start from scratch since 2016. The focus of this training, again, is for city and town candidates, and it really is kind of designed for this upcoming election, the August-November 2022 cycle. Now, again, most of the information is going to apply to any city or town election. So if you happen to be in a charter city that's having its election November, March, or you're having it March, May of next year, this all applies, but there are some dates in here that are specifically for August, November. Also, you can always contact your clerk if you have general questions about campaign finance. So your clerk is the filing officer designated by statute to assist you with the campaign finance filings. So if you have general questions, they can direct you to the report forms to use, to the handbooks that are available, but they cannot ask or answer specific questions, right? They can't help you with, where do I put this item in which category on which schedule? That's just, they're not authorized to do that. And they are actually the ones that have to review any complaints filed against you, including reports. So they're not able to provide you with any specific guidance. You either need to maybe, chat with fellow candidates, someone you trust, maybe a treasurer, or maybe even get your own legal counsel. And so the objective today is just to provide a comprehensive review of the campaign finance laws for local candidates. Again, this is based on state law. So, the laws apply to everyone from the state and all the way down to us local candidates. But there are some particular differences for city and town candidates that we'll discuss. Next slide. So this is the overview. So we're going to talk a little bit about those laws and the guidance that are available. Registration requirements. So what essentially is required, or when you hit that threshold that you then have to register as a committee. And then also your reporting, what that form looks like and the details that are required by statute. And then your advertising disclosures, what those requirements are and where those need to be. And then any enforcement penalties that may apply if campaign finance complaints are filed. Now, what we're not discussing is anything related to federal campaign finance law. Sometimes we have people ask questions about federal law. That does not apply to you as a local candidate, so we're not going to be discussing it. Also, anything relating to political action committees, also known as PACs. So this training is specific to you as a local candidate. PACs are separate. Now, there's going to be a lot of overlap, and I'll try to mention that as we go along. But PACs sometimes have some different requirements that you don't have to follow. So this is only specifically for candidates. And then also, we're not really going to go into charter provisions. So if you're in a charter city, you may have additional requirements. And so I encourage you, again, you can reach out to the clerk and say, hey, where can I find the charter? And they can direct that, where you can find it. It might even be on their website. And then you can take a look at anything that's election related. Sometimes some of the cities have extra requirements for contribution disclosures or any other type of disclosure. So you want to be aware of that. But we're not going to discuss it in detail because there's 19 charter cities. And so that's just a lot of information. So you need to get that information from your clerk. And then special election requirements, right? We're not going to talk about recall elections or anything like that. And so we are going to I wanted to kind of touch on, as we walk through the presentation, we're going to hit on certain topics, and these topics actually fit into what I would have kind of designated as the top 10 campaign finance complaints that I've seen over the past several years. So that's failure to register as a committee, right? Someone isn't registering when they're hitting the appropriate threshold. Failure to amend their statement of organization, maybe when they have a change of address, or maybe they're changing their treasurer. Failure to disclose personal monies. A lot of times people think, well, it's my personal monies. It's not subject to contribution limits. I don't have to disclose. That's incorrect. So we'll talk about that. Failure to disclose in-kind contributions. This gets very confusing for a lot of people. What is in-kind? And so we'll talk about that. Accepting unlawful contributions. Candidates are not allowed to accept contributions from corporations. And so that's a big no-no, and that inadvertently happens quite a bit. So we'll talk about that more. Failing to timely submit a complete campaign finance report. And so there's two key words in there, the timely, right? Making sure you're actually hitting the deadline appropriately, but also that it's complete. failing to report the cumulative amount in that first report. So sometimes when people are filing their first report, they've just registered, they don't realize that they need to make sure that they've actually accounted for every single penny from the moment they actually started their received a contribution or expenditure. And then also failing to include their disclosure for their advertisement on their campaign finance materials. We see this a lot. Failure to respond to a campaign finance complaint if it's forwarded to you by the clerk, and then failure to terminate your committee. So these are all things that I've seen a lot where we're getting these types of complaints. And so we'll kind of touch on these throughout the presentation to help you avoid them. Okay, so laws and guidance for municipal candidates. Okay, so this is just an overview of kind of basically what guides everyone, right, with campaign finance in Arizona. So we have Title 16 in Chapter 6. And I have my visual aid here. So this is the actual Arizona election book. So these are all the election statutes, right? It's actually quite thick, as you can see. And then there's a small provision in here. It's a chapter. That's all the campaign finance statutes. So that's probably our primary guidance. There's also a couple constitutional provisions. And then we have additional guidance by the Secretary of State. So we have the Campaign Finance Candidate Guide. And so that was just issued in April. And so it's updated for you, and that was sent as part of your materials. And then we also have the PAC Guide, and it does say 2022, but it actually is still the February 2020. I did double check. They haven't updated that PAC Guide. You still have it in your materials, but it's the February 2020 version, and that's fine. Again, one, it doesn't apply to you because you have the candidate guide, and really there haven't been too many laws that have changed. So I think they're probably in process to update that. Also, the other guidance is the 2019 State Election Procedures Manual. So that's that state manual that the Secretary of State has to issue to provide sort of uniformity in election laws. And they work with all of the counties to publish that document, and then it has to go for approval to the governor and the attorney general. So you may have heard in the news, there's, I think, some dispute about the 2021 version. This is the 2019 version. It's still on the Secretary's website, and it does provide guidance about the campaign finance laws. There's been some questions, I think, of certain individuals saying that because the 2021 is not in effect, that we can't rely on the 2019. So sort of my, opinion about that, is that until sort of there's a court order that says that we can't rely on the 2019, we are still going to rely on it. And part of that is because that manual has the force and effect of law under statute. So it's ARS 16-452. It actually requires the secretary to issue this manual and has the force and effect of law. And there are criminal penalties if you don't follow that. So we're going to follow that until we get something definitive from a court that says we can't or we shouldn't. So just so you know, that's why we're still following that 2019 version. And then I had a brief thing I talked about the charter cities. So if you're in a charter city, you're not sure if you are, these are the charter cities. And so if you're in one of these cities, just chat with your clerk, make sure you have everything you need in case there's anything else additional relating to campaign finance. Okay, so let's talk about campaign finance. So that refers to monies that are received and also anything of value that's spent to promote a candidate or a ballot measure. So it seems pretty simple that that's essentially what campaign finance is, but as we know, it's much more complex. Okay, so these are your responsibilities. So first, you have to determine if you need to register as a committee, right? As a candidate, what are your responsibilities? And then if you're registering, then making sure you have the appropriate forms to register. So you need what's called a statement of organization. And I know there's a lot of other statements out there when you're running as a candidate, and it can get very confusing. So make sure you have the right form. It's a statement of organization. And then also you want to get that candidate guide that we sent you as part of the materials. And then any reporting forms from the clerk. And I want to just pause really quickly right here because the Secretary of State, they issued that candidate guide, that April 2022 version that we sent you. In the back, you'll see that there's a sample campaign finance report form. It's dated 12/29/2021. You probably, if you've already been filing reports, you've been using a previous version, which is fine, because again, the law hasn't necessarily changed. They just do minor updates here and there. So we just got copies of the 12/29/2021, which is the most recent version of the campaign finance report form. And so the league should probably be sending that out to the clerks, who will then be sending that out to you here soon. So just make sure you're using the right form, because the next filing deadline is July 15th. And then for filing, you want to make sure that you're filing your reports timely. And so you understand when those deadlines are and how to get that information to the clerk. And then also responding to the clerk's reporting reminders, right? Sometimes they're going to send you reminders about those reports. And then if a complaint is filed, you want to respond to that as well. Okay, registration requirements. All right, so first, are you a candidate running for a city or town office, right? So if you are, then you have to look at, have you met that $500 threshold by receiving or spending any monies totaling $500? And so if yes to both, right, you're running as a municipal candidate here in Arizona and you've met that $500 threshold, then you are required by law to register within 10 days of reaching that threshold. Okay, next. So how do you determine if you've met that threshold? So essentially it's, again, receiving contributions or making expenditures in any combination of at least $500 in connection to your candidacy during the election cycle. And we'll kind of break down what all these terms mean. So first, let's talk about sort of that $500 and what does it mean in any combination. So for example, if you have a candidate who receives $300, right? So you've got $300, you're under the 500 threshold, but then you spend $200, on whatever, signs, anything like that, you've reached $500, right? So it doesn't have to just be a total of $500 here in contributions or a total of expenditures over here. It's a combination. Anything that hits that $500 threshold in a combination, then that means you have to register as a committee. So as you can see, it's pretty easy for you to hit that threshold. And then essentially, we used to have this thing called the threshold exemption, where if you were under 500, you still had to file a statement. That went away when the 2016 laws were repealed. So you don't have to file anything until you hit that $500 threshold. And then again, you have 10 days to come in and file that statement of organization. The important thing, though, also to remember is just because you don't have to file that $500, that statement of organization yet until you reach the $500 threshold, you should be tracking all of your monies received and spent from day one, right? Again, every single penny, you should have all that information, because if you hit that threshold and you have to file a report, all of that information is going to be required. Okay, so how do you register? Let's decide, you've decided, okay, yes, I've reached the threshold. How do I register? Again, that statement of organization form is part of the clerk's packet that they give to you. So the clerk is the filing officer. Within 10 days of qualifying as a committee, you submit that form. Okay, so what is the statement of organization? It's just a registration form. Those of you who filled it out have seen it. It's just essentially some contact information, basic, address, contact, and then also your bank account, like not necessarily your bank account number, but who are you banking with? So it's just essentially a simple kind of registration form, just so that they know who to contact and what kind of committee it is that you have. And then the clerk will issue you an identification number once you file that statement of organization, and then that number should be on all your future reports. So for your statement of org, you do have to identify a chair and a treasurer. Now, this is where things are a little different for candidates versus PACs. So for a candidate, you can be your chair and the treasurer. So you don't have to go out and find somebody else to do that for you. If you have a PAC, it has to be separate individuals. So as a chair, this is just, again, the person who's kind of assigned to do, the day-to-day duties, kind of oversee. The treasurer is the custodian of the committee's books and accounts. This is a really big responsibility. You are signing off on all financial transactions, and you remain legally and personally responsible for filing campaign or complete and accurate campaign finance reports. So this really comes into play if you get a campaign finance complaint. So just make sure that if you're asking someone to be your treasurer, that they understand the responsibilities, let them see that handbook and where it says this in the statute, They understand what their duties and obligations are. So a candidate committee may not engage in any financial activity without the authorization of the treasurer. And again, most times, I think especially at our level, it tends to be the same person, right? The candidate is just their own treasurer. So that's fairly simple. But if you are using a treasurer, a separate person, just obviously make sure you're in constant communication about the money going in and out. Okay, next. So what information again has to be included? We kind of chatted about this. It's just the committee name, the email address, telephone number, mailing, website, and again, the name of any banks or other financial institutions used by the committee. Now, sometimes we have requests from the candidates asking the clerks to help them with the banking issue, because sometimes we have banks that are really well versed in setting up these candidate accounts and others that are not. And even those that are well versed in it and know how to do it, they sometimes make you jump through some hoops, right? The clerk has no authority or responsibility or any ability to help you with the banks. So I know that can be frustrating, but they just don't have that authority. So I would just try to work with the bank. Sometimes I've seen other candidates maybe again call other candidates, friends who've run, or to say, hey, what bank do you use? Maybe you need to open another account somewhere else with a bank that's willing to work with you. But unfortunately, it's not something that the city or town clerk can help you with. Okay, so chairperson information. So again, you're just getting your basic information, right? Name, the street address, email address, telephone number, and then occupation. And this should be just the primary occupation if there's sort of multiple jobs, and then the employer. So again, this is just sort of the primary employer. For the treasurer, again, we're also just looking for kind of that basic information, right? The name, email, occupation, street address, telephone number, and employer. I will say the reason why we ask for the email address is this is your primary form of contact, and this is how it is designed in statute now. So you need to make sure you have a good active email address, because this is where complaints might be forwarded to you by the clerk. This is where maybe notifications are going to be sent to you about deadlines for reporting. And it's your responsibility to make sure that you have, again, you're checking your spam folders, that you're getting everything that you need, because we are designated essentially in statute to be able to send this to you via email. Okay, so separate bank accounts. You do have to create that separate bank account. It can't be into your personal account, right? So if you have a candidate account that you're creating, you cannot commingle. So make sure that you have a separate account that you're setting up. And again, the banks may have a different procedure for you to go through in order to set that up. So finalizing the statement of organization, again, it's just this kind of one-page registration form, or actually 2 pages, and then you're just signing it, under penalty of perjury that everything is correct, that you've also read your candidate guide, and that you're agreeing to comply with campaign finance law, and that you are, again, here accepting all notifications, service of process, or important documents via that committee's email address. So again, if you have any issues with your email, something's corrupted, or, a virus, or you can't access it and you need to change it, you need to alert the clerk as soon as possible. So again, all this information is going to be sent to you via email. Original signatures are no longer required on the statement of organization. As long as you type it out, it's essentially deemed as an electronic signature. And then also, again, as I mentioned, once that registration form is complete, that statement of organization, the clerk is going to issue you an identification number. That ID number needs to be on every report, and it also needs to be on your termination statement. Okay, so what about changing your statement of organization? So let's say, again, maybe your email address has changed, or maybe you've moved, or maybe you've changed your treasurer. So any change to anything that's listed on your statement of organization, you need to file an amended statement within 10 days of that change. And it's pretty simple. Again, you can just call the clerk or access the form and fill that information out, and then they'll, same serial number, it's just going to be an amended form. Okay, so treasurer's record keeping responsibilities. So I told you that the treasurer is very important in this process, right? Because they have sort of hold all the financial responsibility for your committee. So if this is you as the candidate, then you need to make sure you're understanding your obligations. So the candidate committee is required to keep records of all of the following. So all contributions made or received by the committee. So remember, maybe you haven't hit that $500 threshold yet. And so you're not worried about reporting, and maybe you don't think you're even going to hit that threshold. You still are required by law to keep track of all of your contributions or expenditures, because just in case you hit that threshold, you're going to have to report it all, and you're not going to want to backtrack and try to fill in the blanks later. Also, the identification of any contributor that contributes in the aggregate of at least $50 to the committee during the election cycle, regardless of amount and residency. This is in-state or out of state. And then this is going to be a little bit different from what we're going to talk about in a moment when we talk about reporting. Okay, so this is record keeping. You have to keep that ID of a contributor who contributes in the aggregate at least $50 to the committee, right? So what that essentially is saying is if someone's giving you just $20, technically there's no requirement for you to know that identity of the contributor, right? But again, if they give you $30 later, then you are going to need to keep track, because now you've hit the 50. So that's why I always just suggest just try to get all the information immediately once you get a contribution. It just saves you a lot of headaches later. Also, the name and address of every person that receives a contribution. So you should be getting kind of their basic contact information. You need to know the date that they're giving you the contribution, or when you're giving the expenditure, and the amount, and then the purpose. And then committee is required to keep all your records for at least 2 years following the end of the election cycle. And we'll talk more about the election cycle later, but that's essentially a 2-year cycle. So you're really keeping your records almost kind of 4 years from the beginning of the election cycle. And then on request of the clerk or the city or town attorney, who is the enforcement officer for campaign finance complaints, a committee that has filed their statement of organization shall produce records required by your treasurer, essentially. And then a person that qualifies as a committee, again, has to report all their contributions, expenditures, disbursements occurred before you hit that threshold. So that's why I'm saying it's just important from day one. Even if you're not even sure you're going to hit the threshold and have to register and report, it's just best for you if you start documenting everything from the beginning. Okay, and then the committee, now this is reporting. So that for other slide was record keeping responsibilities. This is reporting. So you have to report all contributions made or received by the committee. Also, again, ID, the address, occupation, employer of any in-state contributor whose contributions exceed $100 during the election cycle. Now, this is new. Last year, the legislature sort of separated out in-state versus out of state. So now in-state contributors, you can exceed that $100, and then that you have to report that contribution. Also, the ID, address, occupation of any out-of-state contributor. So that's the difference. So in-state, if they hit that $100, then that's when you report their contribution. But for out-of-state, they can give you $1 and you have to report that contribution. So those are the differences. So make sure you understand where that money is coming from. And then also contributions from political action committees. If any PACs give you money to support your candidacy, then you need to report that. Also, any totals contributed by the contributor during the election cycle by each contributor, and then also just an itemized list of all disbursements in excess of $250. And so again, you're going to need that same basic information: name, address, description of the disbursement, and the date. Okay, so recording your receipt of contributions. This is kind of to help you figure out when, sort of when everything is triggered, right? So a contribution is deemed to be received on either the date that you as the committee knowingly takes possession of the contribution, right? So maybe you're having like a in-person fundraiser and they're handing you the money. So you're knowingly taking possession, or maybe you've gotten something in the mail and it's the date of the check or credit card payment. So knowingly takes possession, this is how it's defined in statute, means the committee is aware that it possesses a contribution. And so for in-kind contributions, so in-kind is different, right? So this is not money. This is usually goods and services. So in-kind means essentially the contribution is made when the date of the services are performed, or the date the committee receives the services. And so you get to choose kind of which one this is for both when you receive a contribution for monetary or in kind, but I would encourage you to be consistent as you can, to make sure that you're always, maybe you're always just going by the date of the check or credit card payment, or maybe you're always going by the date you receive services. That just helps you in the long run if you are facing a campaign finance complaint. What about incomplete contributions? So this happens frequently. Maybe you didn't get all the information, right? Maybe you got the name and address of somebody, but you didn't get their occupation. Maybe you can't remember the date. So you have a responsibility as, again, candidate and your treasurer to make the best efforts to seek any missing information. And these are things, again, that we do see in campaign finance complaints, right? That you have blanks on your report form. And so if a complaint is filed, then you're going to need to explain why that information is not listed. And this is kind of how they've prescribed it in statute. So best efforts essentially means that you have to make at least one attempted written communication. That's email, text, social media, private message, any other type of communication, or at least one attempted oral communication to the contributor that is documented in writing. So you need to make some effort to contact that contributor to find out that information. And then you want to clearly ask for obviously what it is you're missing. And then you need to report that. So let's say you submitted a report because you didn't want to miss the deadline, but there's blanks. And in the meantime, you've been trying to hunt down that information. And let's say you finally get that information. Then all you need to do is file an amended report with that information in there. So that's essentially the process. So recording receipts of expenditures. So that's all been contributions, right? So that's what you've been receiving as the candidate committee. Expenditures are what you're giving out, right? What are you paying? So the expenditure disbursement is deemed made either on the date, again, when the committee's authorized monies to be spent, or the date the monies are withdrawn from the committee's account. So again, you kind of get to choose which one that is, but I would try to be consistent. So these are kind of some examples that are in statute. For check, obviously it's going to be the date the committee signs the check. Credit card, when of course it's authorized to charge the credit card. Same thing with electronic, transactions. And then for an agreement to purchase goods or services, it's made on the date the parties enter into the agreement or the date the purchase order is issued. So if a expenditure or disbursement doesn't really fall neatly into one of these categories, then you can kind of treat it as being made on the date the committee authorized the expenditure or the date it's withdrawn from the committee's account. So again, as I've kind of mentioned a few times, just make sure you're consistent, right? Because it's going to be harder for you if campaign finance complaint is filed to sort of justify why over here you took it on this date, but on these other types of expenditures, you took it on a different day. It's the more consistent you are, the more it helps you down the road. So I kind of put in a couple questions here. So multiple committees, because sometimes we get this. Can I have more than one committee? So you can have only one campaign committee in existence for the same office during the same election cycle. So essentially, let's say you're a council member and you have a committee open because you were on council, and then you've decided that maybe you want to run for mayor. And so you open a separate committee. That's fine. Those are two separate offices, but you can't have more than one, council member committee open just for that one position or that same office. And that just has to do with contribution limits, right? They don't want anybody double dipping. Another question here is I have a committee open from the previous election cycle, right? And I'm running for re-election. Do I need to close it and open a new committee? And the answer is no. You can just keep your committees open. And we'll talk about sort of the reporting deadlines and how they work. And it's actually a little bit easier for candidates now, sort of during your downtime when you're not actually actively running for office, you really don't have to report much. So it's not going to sort of be a burden on you. And then what if you have an open committee for council from a past election cycle, but again, this year, maybe you're running for a different office. Do you need to close that committee? Again, no, you can keep that sort of council committee open and reopen, or open a new mayoral, but just remember that you're still going to have reporting responsibilities for both. So for committee registration, can a candidate who does not meet the $500 threshold still register as a candidate committee? So we've gotten this question over the years, and yes, I mean, you can always file a statement of organization. The threshold is there just as the requirement. But just remember that if you decide to register and file your statement of organization, that you are then held to the reporting requirements. So you can't sort of pick and choose, well, I'm going to file my statement and be an active committee, but wait, I'm not really technically hit the threshold, so I'm not going to report. If you file the statement of organization, then you need to report. And you may ask, why do you even want to do that if you haven't hit that $500 threshold? And most of the time, it's just for transparency reasons, or kind of from what we've kind of discussed, you might see you're going to have to track everything from the first penny anyway. Sometimes it's just easier. You know what I mean? If you can just file it and have everything reported, then it makes it easier down the road. And then if a candidate only spends his or her own monies, does a candidate have to register and report if they meet the $500 threshold? So let's say you're just doing your own personal monies, right? You're not really accepting contributions, but yes, you still have to register. So personal monies are contributions. They are included in that calculation. The only benefit is that the personal monies aren't subject to contribution limits. And we'll talk about the limits in a little bit. So you can give unlimited amounts of your own personal monies, but you still have to register and you'll still have to disclose. Okay, I think we're going to stop here and see if there's any other questions.
Awesome. I have a committee for this election and plan to terminate it after the election. Can I reuse my signs for the next election without forming a committee again?
So I think that depends. So the question about sort of, you've kind of purchased it, right? So you've purchased something in your current candidate committee and you're going to close that committee. And so whether or not you can reuse those signs. So you're going to have to look at when you reuse them, what is that fair market value of that contribution and whether or not it hits that threshold to where you would have to, again, sort of form another committee. Signs can be expensive. It kind of depends on how many signs you have, how big they are. So that's unfortunately pretty fact specific that I can't give you an absolute answer, but you would need to look at that in-kind, that value of the in-kind contribution, essentially, because it is a contribution, even though it's from the next, election cycle, to see if that actually triggers a new registration requirement.
Can a candidate determine whether a contribution was meant for the previous election cycle or the current election cycle?
Okay, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Can a candidate determine whether a contribution was meant for the previous election cycle or the current election cycle?
Okay, so when you receive the contribution, no. I mean, I know there's those kind of markers about like when a contribution is deemed to be accepted, but it is during the election cycle. And as we talk more about when that stops, it's really pretty specific about the dates. So if you're receiving something within like this current election cycle was January 1 of 2021. It goes all the way through December 31st of 2022, right? So it's a 2-year block. And so if you're receiving a contribution during that time frame, then it's this election cycle, right? You can't sort of attribute it to a past election cycle.
For in-kind contributions, if it's just a temporary loan of equipment, does that need to be reported?
Okay, so loans do have to be reported. There's a specific schedule that talks about loans. So I think when we kind of maybe get to that section, we'll kind of see maybe where this particular question kind of fits in there, but there is a specific there's actually a few schedules that talk about loans. I think like once you've made the loan and then someone guarantees the loan and then as you pay the loan back. So I think they've kind of contemplated some of that. So it's just a different schedule.
How do you report using your own monies? Do you list yourself as a donation? How does that work?
So there is a schedule on your report form that actually says the contributor, it's your candidate's use of personal monies. So it's in Schedule A and it talks about, essentially we'll have a little block of information where you just need to fill out your basic information. Again, it's the same that they get for any contributor, right? Name, address, all of that, and then just the amount.
Can I keep my committee open and close my bank account after the election if there's no money?
So you are supposed to have as long as you have an active committee open, you should have a corresponding active bank account. So if you're going to close that bank account because it's 0, then you should go ahead and close your committee, making sure that also is 0. And then you can just form a new committee if you hit that threshold later.
All right, and then this says $50 threshold, or is it 100? Can we clarify where the money?
Yeah, no, it's very confusing. So it used to be $50 across the board. Like I said, last year, the legislature changed it. So what they're saying now is that if you receive $50 from somebody, $50 or more, you're required to have all that contributor information as your record keeping responsibilities. But you don't have to report it unless you hit the $100 for an in-state contributor. But if you're an out-of-state contributor, then you have to report it like the minute they give you a penny. So it's kind of like a delineation. There's like these reporting responsibilities for something over $50 for in-state versus you actually report it when it's 100. So that's why I just feel like it's better for you to just go ahead and start, keeping track of it. And then you'll see on the schedule where it says, anything aggregate of $100 or more, or, then that's, you'll know, you'll be triggered to know that that's where you have to report it. There shouldn't be anything on the report form anymore that says $50. It's just your record keeping responsibilities refer to the $50. So I know that's confusing. They just made that change last year. So we'll see how this works out and if maybe they'll change it again.
Last question, and for now, do you need to report when a service is provided at a reduced price? So maybe you got a discount.
Yes. So that is part of like your in-kind. If you get a discount, then yes, that's what needs to be reported. And we'll talk a little bit more about in-kind as we get into the actual campaign finance report form. So, okay, and we'll take more breaks as we kind of go along here. So let's talk about key terms. So the first one is contributions. Okay, so what is a contribution? So this is any money, an advance, a deposit, or other thing of value. And I have this bolded for a reason, right? Other thing of value. It is very broad definition. So it's not just money, it's anything of value. And this is what kind of captures the in-kind, the goods and services. And it's made to a person for the purpose of influencing an election. So contribution includes anything made to retire campaign debt from a previous election cycle, money or the fair market value of anything directly or indirectly provided to the official for that purpose of defraying like expenses with constituents, full purchase price of any item from a committee, and then a loan that is made to a committee. So these are just some examples of what is a contribution. And then a person may make any contribution not otherwise prohibited by law. Now, this was part of that change in 2016. They sort of have this as the header at the beginning of the statute that says, if it's not specifically prohibited, then it's allowed. And then they have a list of what is not a contribution. And so contributions also have to be reported, again, unless they're exempt by state law. So let's go through the list of what is not a contribution, and you're going to see there's a lot, right? So we have that very broad definition, any money, advance, anything of value is a contribution, and then we're kind of narrowing it based on these exceptions. So individual volunteer or expenses that are provided without compensation or reimbursement. And so it has some examples here of like maybe travel expenses, use of real or personal property, maybe somebody's hosting a gathering for you, a cost of invitations or food or beverages, use of email, internet activity or social media, maybe they're forwarding one of your social media messages, right? That as a volunteer who's just, on your, helping you with your campaign, that is not a contribution. So you do not have to essentially report that information. But just make sure you're careful with the social media because this is, again, sort of social media, like maybe from my personal page, right? I'm just retweeting something that a candidate had on their page. That would be volunteer, not a contribution. But if I went ahead on Facebook and I paid for an ad to boost that post, well, then that's going to be a contribution, right? So you just kind of have to, again, this is why you need to make sure you understand where the money's coming from and how it's being transmitted. So also what is not a contribution is any type of news story, right? We see a lot of media reports, whether in print or broadcast or radio, anything like that, as long as the cost of the news story is, again, not paid for or owned by the candidates committee. And then any payment to, if you were doing some type of, as an elected official, let's say you're an incumbent, that you were doing some type of informational tour or conference or something like that, any payment to defray the cost of that, they kind of see that as part of your official duties and not necessarily related to your campaign. So again, as long as the payor or the elected official isn't attempting to influence the election, then it's not a contribution. So also what is not a contribution is the payments of a political party to support its nominee. Now, this is not going to apply to 90 cities and towns. There's one city and town that has partisan elections, and that's Tucson. So the rest of you, this doesn't even apply because you have to be the actual nominee of a political party. And then see the payments by any person, again, to defray like political party operating costs, again, does not apply to nonpartisan elections. So this last bullet point here is the following are not contributions. It's the value of the following to the committee. And there's a kind of a little bit of a list here. So interest earned on your committee's deposits or investments. So maybe you're making some interest on what's in your account. Transfers between committees to reimburse through a joint fundraising effort. If again, you have sort of an executed agreement, and we'll talk about joint fundraisers in a little bit. And then also payment of a committee's legal or accounting expenses by any person. This is not a contribution. And I have it bolded because this was subject to litigation for a couple of years. And it was sort of on hold. And we were, encouraging people to still report it because it had been enjoined by the court. That case is now over, and they have said, no, this is in fact what the statute says, that payment of a committee's legal or accounting expenses by any person is not a contribution. So you do not have to report it. And then an extension of credit for goods and services on committee's behalf by a creditor. And again, there are some extenuating kind of conditions here. Okay, so again, if you pay for an attorney for legal advice, can you pay for this service out of your committee monies? And then if you're required to report it. So you can't use your committee monies for personal use, right? So if you're paying an attorney for something unrelated to your campaign, maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's something else, you can't use their campaign monies for that purpose. That would be prohibited. But legal services for your committee, so let's say a campaign finance complaint is filed against you and you need to retain a lawyer to help you fight that campaign finance complaint, yes, that is a lawful use of your campaign monies. And again, this is kind of where I put the sort of recent court case that talks about the state law exempts the payment of your legal or accounting expenses as a definition of contribution and expenditure. So technically it does not need to be reported. Now you still can, just because it says you don't, you still can, but it's not required. So we still have more. What is not a contribution? So value of nonpartisan communications intended to encourage voter registration. So this is just like a general, hey, we're doing a get out the vote type of thing. And you don't have anything related to your campaign as you're participating as a volunteer. That would not be a contribution. Any payment to the clerk for arguments in a publicity pamphlet. Maybe there's a bond election on the same election that you're having your candidate election and you want to, put in an argument for or an against. That's fine. You can make that payment and it's not considered any type of contribution. And then payments by any sponsor or an affiliate of costs for establishing or soliciting contributions from members. And this has to do with a separate segregated fund. I don't think it's going to impact most municipal candidates, but this is really where there's a structure that's created by an employer to sort of lawfully be able to receive contributions and give them to, the committee of their choice. But it's if they follow this proper procedure, it would not be a contribution. And then any payment by an entity for, again, costs communicating with employees again, this is kind of falling in that same category. If they're made in coordination with any candidate or candidate's agent. And then also the value of any candidate or committee's representative to appear at a private residence to speak about like a ballot measure, right? So you're running as a candidate. So a ballot measure is something separate. So it's not really related to your campaign, but it has to meet these requirements, right? So the venue has to be furnished by the venue's owner, not paid by a third party. And they have this thing, it can't be a sports stadium. I'm sure there's a story there, or Coliseum or convention center. And it has to be generally open to the public. So if you kind of meet these criteria and you're speaking about a ballot measure, then it's not a contribution. Okay, and then also the cost of hosting a debate or candidates forum, if there's at least 2 opposing candidates. And then everyone has gotten, their appropriate notice, and method of invitation has been the same for both parties. Preparation, distribution of voter guides, that features, as long as there isn't sort of one, right? They're not highlighting one candidate more than another. That's not a contribution. Monies that are loaned by a financial institution in the ordinary course of business. So again, maybe you have your own business, you're self-employed, and you have a loan out, because it's for your business. That is not a contribution. Now, if you got a loan and it's for your campaign, that is different, and that is a contribution that does have to be reported. So it's just a matter of how you're using that money. And then the cost of publishing a book or producing a documentary, if it's available for public distribution through sort of traditional means, then that's any types of fees related to that would not be a contribution. So as you can see, we have the broad view of what is a contribution, right? Money, advance, anything of value. And then we have this kind of narrowing, that very long list. And that's in your candidate guide as well as statute, where you can kind of go back and reread it, and it tells you what is not a contribution. So methods of accepting contributions. So you can accept it in a lot of ways. So cash, obviously any type of electronic instrument, check, credit card, payroll deduction, online, any really type of transaction is allowable. And you're not required to give a receipt, but I would also say again, especially cash, like, if you're again hosting an event and maybe there's like a jar, sometimes that happens, right? And it's these small dollar amounts. Maybe you want to have like a little sign-in sheet next to it, right? Or somebody of how much they're putting in. And the only reason why I say that is because again, if they hit a certain amount over a period of time, you are then going to be required to report it with the date of that contribution. And if you don't have that information, it's going to make it much harder for you. So you might want to devise a way of making sure that you're tracking that information from day one. And then also cryptocurrency. So we've gotten some questions about cryptocurrency and whether or not, that can be accepted. I'm only aware of like one city that's even looking into accepting cryptocurrency. That doesn't mean you as a candidate can't accept it, but I would just say right now it's pretty much uncharted for campaign finance in Arizona. We don't have any guidance on it. So is it acceptable under the law? Yes, but I'm not entirely sure how that would work and how you would determine the value. So I would strongly suggest that if you're interested and you want to accept cryptocurrency, that you consult with legal counsel to get some advice about that, about what happens when you accept it and you retain it and the value for reporting purposes. Because you don't want a situation where you're receiving a contribution and, it's your contribution limit, is a certain amount and, you received it and it was under, but somehow the value changes before that's, confirmed, and then it goes over the contribution amount. So you just want to be careful with that. And because it's sort of untested here in campaign finance law, I would highly suggest that you talk to an attorney. Okay, so what is an expenditure? So we talked a lot about contributions, right? That's money that you're receiving or anything of value you're receiving. And then expenditures is any purchase or payment or other thing of value, again, very broad, that is made by a person for influencing the election. So this is what's going out, what you as a committee is spending. Again, same as the contributions, it has that sort of catch-all. A person may make any expenditure not prohibited by law. And then we have our long list of what is not an expenditure, although it's not as long as the contributions. So what is not an expenditure, right? Again, we have this whole thing about volunteer services. It's pretty much identical to the contribution. So anything related to travel, the use of their home, food, beverages, etc. And social media, again, only if they're not kind of bolstering it and using paid advertisement. And then that news story, commentary, editorials, that's not an expenditure. Again, as long as the candidate isn't sort of in control of that publication. And then the payment to, again, defray political party costs, which again does not apply to nonpartisan elections. And then also nonpartisan communications, again, that voter registration, arguments for the publicity pamphlet. And then again, that same thing with legal or accounting services, not an expenditure, doesn't have to be reported. And then costs of publishing a book or documentary. So you can see some of that similarities. Okay, so am I limited from accepting contributions from certain contributors? And the answer is yes. So it's your responsibility. You have to pay very close attention to who is giving you contribution to make sure you're not violating the law. So you can only accept as a candidate for local office contributions from individuals, from candidate committees under certain conditions, and we'll talk about what those conditions are, political action committees and partnerships. And then again, if you are in Tucson, then maybe you'll have to talk to the clerk about whether or not you can accept the political party nominee contribution. Candidate committees may not accept contributions from unions, corporations, or LLCs, or any other kind of organization, group, or business entity other than partnerships, right? So partnerships is okay, but any type of corporate structure, it is prohibited from you to receive contributions, and that includes in kind, and that's where I've seen the most campaign finance complaints. So what if I accidentally accept a contribution that's prohibited? Well, this happens. Again, this is an unlawful contribution. Let's say you inadvertently accepted a contribution from a corporation. You have to refund that immediately. So once you become aware of that, you need to return that money, and it needs to be on your report form as a refund. So, you want to maybe document obviously the circumstances that kind of led to that. This helps you in case there's a campaign finance complaint filed against you. So am I limited in how much I can accept in contributions? And yes, there are contribution limits for each sort of level of office. Contributions from allowable sources are subject to contribution limits, and they again vary. Both the candidate and the contributor should really understand, but you're probably going to have to educate the person who's giving you the money. So a lot of times they just want to write the checks, right? So you're going to need to catch it if it's over the amount. Contribution limits are increased by $100 in January every odd numbered year. So and this is the link just to the current contribution limits, but we'll chat about it here. Okay, next. So these are your contribution limits for this cycle. Remember I said January 1 from 2021 through December 31st of this year. We're in that election cycle right now for the August-November election this year. So this is your contribution limits. As you can see, it's pretty high. It's $6,550. That's what you can receive from each individual, from each partnership, from each candidate committee, again, if certain criteria are satisfied, from a PAC. And then you'll see some higher amounts here. So there's also PACs known as mega PACs. And if you get monies from them, you can actually receive double. So 13,100 is the limit. And then again, political parties, so for Tucson only, they have an additional amount that they can receive. And as you can see, corporations, LLCs, all these other trusts, joint ventures, unions, all prohibited. You cannot take monies from any of them. So we've talked a little bit about election cycle, and it's that 2-year period. And it's very confusing the way it's written in statute. So I'm going to read it and then we'll just talk about it. So city and town races, the election cycle constitutes the 2-year period. It begins the first day of the calendar quarter after the calendar quarter in which the city or town's second runoff or general election is scheduled, and then ending on the last day of the calendar quarter in which the city or town's immediately following second runoff or general election is scheduled, however designated by the city or town. So that is not very clear, but essentially what it means, like if you think about it for like this election cycle, right? Let's say you are running here now and for August of 2022 is going to be your election. Well, the election, the scheduled runoff for most cities and towns is November. Now, a lot of you won't have a runoff, right? A lot of times the way that we have it, we have a separate statute in Title IX. It's kind of designed to calculate majority of votes cast to almost avoid a runoff. And so most of you are going to get elected in the primary and won't need a runoff in November. It doesn't matter if the city does or doesn't have a runoff. you still have to base the election cycle on whenever that runoff would have been scheduled. So we're going to look at November. And so November 2022 is when that scheduled runoff is. And so that for these purposes, for that definition that I just read, that would be the, it's in that calendar quarter of October, November, December. So it's in that final quarter, which means that the next quarter is when you would start the new cycle, right? So that's why we hit the January 1, 2023. And then that'll go through December of 2024. So I know it gets really confusing, but luckily you don't really have to figure it out. We do it for you. And so you'll see that on a lot of the schedules. So also, just so you know, there is a separate election cycle created in the event of a recall election or a special election. Those are very specific about when the election is called is when it starts and then how it ends. So just keep in mind that's different. And you don't have to worry about that for a regular candidate election. Now, the reason why election cycles are important is because that's tied to your contribution limits. So your limits, that 6,550 that you can accept from an individual or partnerships or anything like that, it's for your 2-year cycle. So if you have a 4-year office, you can actually get from that same individual 6,550, one 2-year cycle, and then another in the next election cycle for that same office because you're a 4-year term. So that's a lot of contributions that you can receive. And so it's, I think, something that is very helpful for kind of local candidates to be able to run for office. So election cycle here, I kind of try to divide it and kind of provide you sort of a structure of what this looks like. And I kind of did a backtrack so you kind of understood of how we arrived at the current election cycle. So it's kind of what I talked about, right? So if you 2 years ago, your city or town had their August election, maybe they didn't have a runoff, but it would have been in November. So this is when it would have been scheduled through that October 1, December 31st of 2020. And so then that first day of the calendar quarter, after the calendar quarter in which that scheduled runoff occurred, would have been January 1st, 2021. And then you go forward and you look at, okay, when's your next scheduled runoff? And that would be this year, November 2022. And it falls in that, again, that same last quarter. And so December 31st is that last day. So just as an example, and then the next slide also, it just kind of shows you moving forward. It's the same analysis. It's just from like 2022 to 2024. So you do the same thing for the other cities that are on different cycles. So we have, I think Phoenix is on a November, March. So they're going to do theirs differently, right? Because March is in a different calendar quarter. Same thing if you have other cities that are doing the March and May. So they're going to fall in a different calendar quarter. So their cycle is going to probably be like June 1 through May 31st. So your clerk will help you figure that out. And that's also kind of embedded in the campaign finance report forms. So what is the importance of the election cycle? Again, it's tied to your contribution limits and then also when you file your campaign finance reports. So this is what I chatted about earlier, which is, if you have a 4-year term, you basically get 2 bites at the apple, right? From the same contributor. They can give you the max in one 2-year cycle and then give you the max in another. And then as I mentioned, the contribution limit increases $100 every January in odd numbered year. So it's $6,550 for you right now. It's going to go up another $100 in January 1, 2023, and it's going to go up again in January 1, 2025. So $6,750. Okay. What happens if there is no runoff? How is the election cycle determined? Like I said, doesn't matter. It has to do with when your runoff would be scheduled, regardless of whether or not you hold it. So that way nothing fluctuates. It's going to be the same. Okay. I'll pause here just to see if there's any other questions before we jump into the actual reporting.
Okay. Someone personally pays for newspaper ads supporting the candidate. Is this considered an in-kind contribution?
So if they're paying for ads, I think part of it depends on if you know about it. And we'll talk a little bit about independent expenditures. So if someone's paying for an ad and you didn't coordinate with them, which means you didn't know about it, you didn't provide them with any information for that ad, they just did it independently, right, of you, just to support your candidacy, they need to report that possibly as an independent expenditure, but you would not. But if it is something that you did with them, then possibly. So that's kind of a more, again, sort of fact specific question. It sort of depends on where, you know what I mean, kind of your process and your involvement in it. And I'm not sure that it would, I mean, I'm not sure that would be in kind. I'd have to think about that. We might come back to that one.
Okay, and then it sounds like they're having a hard time hearing me, so if you can kind of just repeat.
Okay, yeah, I'll
questions
repeat her
so that they
questions.
can hear it a little
Okay.
bit better. Can nonprofit organizations make contributions?
Okay, can nonprofit organizations make contributions? So if they're a corporation, no. It's if you're registered at CorpCom as a corporation, LLC, any of those that I've kind of mentioned that are prohibited, then they cannot. Now, there are other, I guess, organizations that are, I think, designated under federal law that are like 501c4s. I don't know that they usually give monies to candidates. Usually it has to do more with ballot measures. But if that's how they're organized under federal law, there might be some exemptions to that. So there's something in the statute that you'd want to look at. Look in your candidate handbook, and I think it might outline with certain organizations that you might be able to accept that. But it's a pretty narrow category. So you just want to be careful. Again, you just need to understand how they're organized and whether or not they fall under one of those exemptions.
Okay, we have a couple examples that they want to know whether or not they're considered contributions.
Okay.
The first one would be endorsements by an entity that's not an individual, so maybe an organization or.
Okay, so if you receive an endorsement from an organization, like not individual, is that a contribution? Again, it's a little hard to, I mean, if someone's just vocally, I guess, giving you an endorsement, I'm not sure what that value is. You know what I mean? Because you always have to tie this to a value. Like, how are you going to report that in some type of monetary amount? When it's like a sign or something like that, it's a little bit easy, right? You can call a couple shops, get an average of what the amount is, and you can kind of figure out what that value is. Something sort of like an endorsement, I'm not sure how you value that. So I think that's where it might be tricky. You might need to talk to someone, maybe an attorney, to see if you can value that in some way.
Another example that they're asking about is whether being included on a party or union's organization's email list or being mentioned in their newsletter, if that would be considered a contribution.
Okay, so if you're mentioned in some type of like union email, is that a contribution? So again, I think it depends on what that purpose is, right? So if you're listed as influencing your campaign, essentially, you know, in connection with your candidacy, it's helping to support or bolster your candidacy, then it might possibly be. I think it depends on whether or not it falls under any of those other exemptions that aren't contributions. You know, is this just kind of like a news story where you're mentioned? I mean, that's where it gets a little complicated, because you have to sort of look at, first, you just want to decide, is this a contribution, right? Is it something of value? And if you decide, yes, it's something of value, then you need to look at that list of exemptions. Okay, is it a news story, or is it a documentary, or is it any of these that basically would exempt it as a contribution, so I don't have to report it? And then I think you do need to look at, if it's from a union, you know, that's a prohibited contribution if it is a contribution. So yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces in there. I'm sorry, I can't give you sort of an exact, but that's kind of the framework where you'd look, right? To start first, is it a contribution? You know, is it fall in exemption? If you do find it's a contribution, is it prohibited?
Does the food and beverage exemption apply whether or not, like regardless of whether it was donated by an individual or an LLC?
So the food and beverages, so it really is about volunteer. Like, that's how the statute lists it, you know, like it's your volunteering, and it's really supposed to be designed for, you're holding a party, right? I mean, there's like a fundraising party for you to kick off your campaign. And so it's at somebody's home. Maybe they are catering it. I'm not sure that in itself would be, but if you have somebody else that's paying for it, so maybe there's a PAC, or maybe there is a group that's actually saying, hey, we want to support this candidate too, we'll pay for all the food and beverages, I would think that is a contribution. And again, if it's an LLC, that would be prohibited, because it is in kind, but it's still a contribution from a prohibited contributor. So yeah, you do have to kind of be careful. But if it's, again, a volunteer who they're paying from their own pocket food and beverages, then that is exempt under the statute.
And she'd like to confirm that you cannot receive donations from LLCs or CEOs from nonprofit organizations.
Right, so you're not allowed, if it's a corporation, LLC, or union, that's a prohibited contributor. Okay, so there are some exemptions in statute where you just have to look to see if it's maybe one of those 501(c)(4)s or other organizations where it doesn't fall. But typically, if you're an organization and you're registered at the Corporation Commission, then you're a corporation. And so that would typically fall as a prohibited contributor, and you should not be receiving any type of monetary or in-kind donations from prohibited contributors.
As a candidate, do you need to report the cost of maintaining a website?
Okay, so as a candidate, do you have to maintain or report the cost of maintaining a website? And again, yes, if you are registered and required to report any of your contributions or expenditures, it's likely an operating expense. There is a category on your schedule for that, but yes, you would report anything. And this happens as well with, I've noticed, with supplies. Right? Like, again, maybe you're providing it. It's, from your home, you had an extra ream of paper, or you had, some supplies that you're using for your campaign, and, you're sending out flyers. You still have to report that, right? Again, that's where you have to kind of assess that value. What is that value of that? Even though it's your personal monies and it came from you, you still have to report it on your form, just so that, again, you're just disclosing all of the contributions you received, even from yourself.
Would it be better to play it safe and report an item as an in-kind contribution, even if it potentially meets the non-contribution list?
So is it, I guess, play it safe if you want to report in-kind contribution, even though maybe you're not sure if it is a contribution? I think if you're not sure, it's always best to report. Like if for some reason you're on the bubble, it's not really clear in the statute. And part of this is because, like I said, there's not a lot of guidance, which is very frustrating for everybody. We just have the statute, and sometimes there's gaps in the statute. It doesn't contemplate every situation. And so if you're looking at it and you're like, well, it kind of falls into a couple of these categories, but not really the full, conditions are met to exempt it from a contribution, or maybe I'm just not sure, you might just want to report it. Again, because it's more about the headaches later. If you have an opponent or somebody else who's just keeping an eye on campaign finance reports, and then they file a complaint against you, you're going to have to respond to that anyway. And then ultimately you might just end up filing an amended report. So from my, I'm always suggesting just be as transparent as possible, just because it helps you in the end.
Okay. And then I'm not sure to what they're referring to exactly, but they asked if you could go more in depth about the partnerships example.
Okay. So they asked more about partnerships. I want to say we're going to talk about it more. I'm pretty sure I have something on partnerships.
Okay.
So we'll talk about it, I think, as we get into the reporting, and then if not, then I'll circle back to it at the end.
Awesome. Okay, that's all I have for now.
Okay, so we'll jump into campaign finance reporting. So this is really challenging for everybody. I don't know if you've seen the schedule, but it's pages and pages long, right? It's like almost 80 pages. So a couple of things. So the state has a campaign finance system, and it's designed to kind of almost prompt you to do everything properly, which is great. When I worked at the state's office, it's just wonderful, right? You just plug things in, it kind of comes up to you with different screens. We as local cities and towns are supposed to be able to use that same system. That was part of the 2016 rewrite, as they sort of moved everything to an electronic based system. But the state is just not ready. We kind of check in every election cycle, like, hey, is there any update on when we're going to be able to use the system? I know it's on their to-do list. They did just get the candidate portal for cities and towns this year, which maybe some of you use. It's called Equal, and that was for you to get your signatures online for your petitions. And so I know they're making some strides to get us into the campaign finance system, but it's just a very I think challenging process for them, right? The state and legislative federal candidates, it's a pretty easy way to do everything, but when you start adding locals, counties, cities and towns, we all have some different parameters. And so that's going to be a little bit challenging to build. So we'll keep checking with them. Hopefully one day you'll be in the electronic system, and then this is going to be a lot easier. But in the meantime, what they've designed is the state is required to prescribe forms for the campaign finance reporting. And so that form that we have is from the state, and it has all these schedules. And so we're going to kind of walk through a little bit here of what's on each page, just to give you an idea of what you're supposed to include. So your cover page is essentially, this is your ID number. It's going to be on the top. So that was what was on your statement of organization. That's what you put in that box. Your committee information. You need to make sure that it's, your office saw it, like, select your city or town, list whatever office of your council, of your mayor, however you want to do that. And then also, I just want to kind of remind you too. So all of these statements and reports are required by law to be on the internet. So sometimes we get kind of angry phone calls from people that don't like their information posted. The clerks don't have any choice. This is required to be posted. So just kind of remember that all this information is publicly available on the city or town website. Okay, so next is the reporting period. And so we can see a lot of people confused, and I see a lot of blanks sometimes because people don't know which one to check. And it's a very long list of dates, right? It's almost the entire cover page, and it's very confusing. So sometimes people check the local only boxes because they think, oh, well, I'm a local candidate. This is the box I'm supposed to check. Local only is if you're having a special election or like a recall or something like that. It does not apply to you in your regular candidate cycle. So don't check that box if you're running in August or November this year. You have to select the date that's based on your election cycle. And if you need help with that, that is something the clerk can help you with. They can tell you which reporting period you're in. Your report due, it's the first day is listed in the beginning of the filing period, right? So if your deadline was April 15th. So, but it was capturing everything through March 31st. Well, technically then you could have started, filing your report April 1st. So that's that first day of the filing period. And then the deadline was April 15th. Same thing with the upcoming one. So we're going through until June 30th. That's this next reporting cycle. And that's when it ends. You can start filing July 1. The deadline is July 15th. So all reports are due on the deadline. If you're filing in person, you just need to make sure that you're getting to, the clerk's office to submit that before the deadline. If you're filing electronically, which is fine, the form is designed to be a fillable PDF that you can save, and then you can just email to the clerk. It just has to be sent to the clerk by midnight on that deadline day. So your reporting period, again, all of this is sort of on your cover sheet, and it has it all outlined for you. But reports are generally for candidates. Again, this is different from PACs, so don't worry about what you might see about PACs. But for candidates, it's typically on a quarterly basis, and it's during that calendar quarter. So it's those 3 consecutive calendar months. So it ends on March 31st, June 30th, September 30th, and then December 31st, right? So those are your calendar quarters. And so if an election's scheduled during a particular quarter, so like we're going to have one in August, so then you'll have an extra report. You'll have a pre-election report that's due. It's going to be through 17 days before the election and must be filed 7 days later. So it's due on July 23rd, 2022. And again, I'm not going to get too much into the dates because it's all on your cover sheet. So you're going to see when all of this is due. And then the following third quarter report is due on October 15th. And since you've already done a pre-election report, right, because we kind of split that quarter in half, you're only going to be having to report from July 17th through September 30th, because you've already reported the first 16 days on that pre-primary report, which was due on July 23rd. So for your reporting, again, candidates are different than PACs. So you're only reporting within sort of your 12 months preceding your general election, which is that scheduled runoff date, whether or not you have it. So for city and town candidates, you're just filing during that 12-month period, essentially. Whereas PACs, they actually have to file quarterly all the time. They don't get a break, right? But for you as candidates, you're only filing sort of during this active election cycle. And then once you file your final report in January of next year, if you have a 4-year term, you're done until your next sort of election year, which would be 2026. So you don't have to file for 3 years if you're on a 4-year term. So it's pretty easy. Like there's not a lot of burden. Now you still have to keep track of everything, because when you have that first report due in that January of 2026, you're going to have to, report everything from the end of December 31st, 2022, all the way through. But most times people are not that active, and so they don't have a lot going on. So it's kind of nice, so you don't actually have to have sort of a reporting burden. So these are the reporting deadlines. Like I said, this is also on your cover sheet of the first page of your report form. So it just kind of has outlined sort of what's coming up here. So your next report due is July 15th. So how do I know when to start filing my reports? Again, it's kind of based on the scheduled general runoff date, right? And all of that information is on that cover sheet. And so you don't really have to think about the deadlines. They're all sort of outlined for you. But it has that kind of 12-month look back period. So when you know when to start. And then again, all of this information too is if you're on a different cycle for, March, May, or November, March, then your look back period is a little bit different, but it works the same. And so all that, the dates, all of the date, that's why it's so lengthy. All the dates are included on that cover sheet. So you are still covered. Just remember there can't be any gaps in your reporting. So that's always the most important thing to remember. And then what if I didn't have a committee open until this year? So let's say you just brand new, you just decided to open your committee. So your first report is due on the next filing deadline after you file your statement of organization. So for example, if you filed it, today, June 2nd, your next report is due July 15th, right? And then you were going to report not just from when you filed your statement of org from today onward, but from any time you've received a contribution or an expenditure in connection with your candidacy. So maybe you received monies last year, but you didn't hit that $500 threshold. Whenever that first penny, was either received or expended, and now you're hitting that threshold, you're going to want to report all of that on your first report. And there's a checkbox in the beginning that kind of tells you, like when you're first starting off, sort of because you don't fit neatly maybe into the calendar quarter, you'll still want to check that box, but you're going to also want to fill out on the top that says sort of the date of when you're sort of started. Okay, so do I file a report in non-election years? I know this is what I kind of mentioned. And so no, right? PACs, yes, but candidates, no. You're only filing during that preceding 12-month window. And so essentially you're filing this year, and your last report's going to be January 17th of 2023. And that's going to basically include everything through the end of the year, right? December 31st. Now I've had some questions about, well, what happens if we don't have a runoff? Right? There's no election in November at all for the city or town. Do I still need to file a report in, January through December because I've essentially finished everything? And the answer is, for me, I would suggest yes, because again, you're going to have to report again. And it's, I think, a lot cleaner for you if you end the cycle, right? You've reported through the cycle, December 31st, 2022. That way, when you're picking it up in 4 years or 3 years, you're going to be starting right from that date of January 1, 2023. I think if you start trying to piece it apart, it's going to get more difficult for you. And I think there's also, you could be challenged, right? There could be someone that says you didn't file timely. So I do think it's best to just go ahead and complete that cycle. And then just also with the reporting date, I wanted to mention, so right now it's on the 15th of sort of the month after the end of the calendar quarter. The legislature has just changed the deadline, but it's not going to be in effect for a few months here, whenever they end session. But it probably will by January. And what it is, it's going to be on that sort of third Monday after the calendar quarter ends. And I think that's going to be easier because a lot of these deadlines have been falling on the weekend, which again, doesn't matter too much to the state because they have the electronic system and anybody can kind of input that. But for all of you who might want to actually submit your reports in person, cities and towns aren't open on Saturdays or Sundays. So I think it's going to make it much easier for having it to be that third Monday. So just kind of be on the lookout. Again, I don't think it's going to probably change soon just because we're waiting for the legislature to adjourn and then we have to wait the 90 days. So I think you're okay for probably your July 15th and your pre-election report. For August, we'll kind of have to see in November. So just be on the lookout in case you get any notices from your clerks about that. But it should be in effect, I would say, by January. Why aren't all candidates filing reports at the same time? We get this question a lot. So since that law only requires you to file during your 12 months preceding your election for your office, and most cities and towns have staggered terms, not everybody is on the same cycle. So if you're running for election this year, then you're actively reporting. But if you have, say you're an incumbent and you're actively reporting, but maybe you have somebody else on your council and they're not up for election until 2024, they're not having to report anything because it's not within that 12-month window for their election. So that's a little bit of a distinction, and that is different. That's not how it used to be before 2016. And so I know that's sometimes confusing to people. Okay, so filing campaign finance reports. So Arizona law spells out various categories of information that have to be included in your reports. And this is all prescribed by the state, these forms. And again, this can be obtained from your clerk. So these are kind of some of the categories, right? You're looking at your cash on hand. What do you have at the beginning of the reporting period? Your total receipts. That has to be obviously everything that during the reporting period, any type of contributions or other form of income received by the committee. And then contributions from in-state, again, remember, this is that new law, right? So in-state individuals whose contributions exceed $100 for the election cycle, but then any contribution from out of state in any amount. So keep that in mind. And those schedules have been updated in the report form. So that should help you. Also contributions from other candidate committees. And again, only if certain conditions are met, and we'll talk about those. And then contributions from PACs, if you get any contributions from other committees. Contributions to political parties. So again, doesn't apply to nonpartisan, most of us. Contributions from partnerships, from your own personal monies, and then any loans made to the committee. And so that's all that information. If you need your kind of the name, the address, and any other kind of information that's in the box. The schedules are pretty clear, like they tell you exactly the information that's required by statute for each category. Also rebates and refunds, interest on committees, fair market value of in-kind contributions, extensions of credit, again, contributions for in-state individuals, cumulative totals, and certification. I know I'm kind of walking through this fast, but it's all kind of outlined in that candidate handbook. And so I would encourage you to kind of go back if you want more information about like what all of these particular categories mean, because that might give you some references to the definitions as well. So that was sort of the first part of the report form, right? That is all the information that's listed there. And then the bottom of the cover page sort of has this total from the Schedule A. Schedule A is the third page now, because the second page is just your signature page. So the third page is Schedule A, and it's the summary of contributions and receipts. And then the total from Schedule B is page 4, and that has a very lengthy summary. And so all of that, your totals from A and B need to be listed on your first cover page, right? In that box that has financial summary at the bottom. If for some reason you have, in your balance at the close of the reporting period, right? So you're doing all your totals and then that's your balance. And then if for some reason, let's say from one period to a next, you haven't had any contributions or expenditures, so nothing has changed, you can just check the no activity box at the bottom. And sometimes that does happen, especially earlier in the cycle where you're just not, actively receiving contributions or making expenditures, but you are still required to report. And so you can just check that box and then you don't really have to resubmit everything. And again, that signature page, you want to go ahead and print and sign that before submitting to the clerk, and list your committee ID number on that page as well. Okay, so that was kind of the first sort of 4 pages of the report form. And so we'll talk a little bit about types of contributions and kind of go more in depth into the individual schedules. So we have monetary contributions. We talked about that, right? We have some loans and then we have in-kind. So reporting individual, so this is Schedule A1A. I have all these listed so you kind of can correspond to the schedule if you want to look. Again, you have that report form at the back of that candidate handbook. So we sent that out. It says April 2020. Make sure you're looking at the candidate, not the PAC handbook. And this is the report form is in the back. So if you want to follow along. So this is reporting individual contributions, in-state contributors over $100. You're doing all the regular information they require, right? You know, contributor's name, address, occupation, employer. Couple things to note. So foreign nationals, so you're not required to go and make sure that someone who's giving you a contribution is a citizen, but you are not allowed to be taking contributions from foreign nationals. So if you suspect that you are, you're going to want to check that out just to be careful because you're going to have to refund that anyway, since that's a prohibited contribution. Joint contributions from spouse. So spouses each have their own contribution limit, but they are permitted to make a joint contribution. But special rules apply. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but I have the reference here if you want to take a look at the statute. And I believe the candidate handbook talks about that as well. Lobbyists. So, you know, local jurisdictions just may have some prohibitions against lobbying contributions. I know of a few cities that do. So again, that's just something you want to check. If there's anything in the charter or if there's anything with the clerks that show that you can't accept contributions from certain individuals. Minors, so they are permitted to make contributions, but it's essentially then treated as a contribution from their custodial parent. So I don't know how many minors give money to campaigns, but maybe they do. You're just going to want to look into it carefully to make sure you're properly recording it. Okay. Individual contributions from, again, we're still on the in-state. So this is $100 or less. So remember how I said for record keeping requirements, you're going to want to sort of keep track of anybody over $50, although I suggest just keeping track from the beginning at 1 penny. But reporting, or it's going to be $100 or more. That's when you have to outline, the name, address, occupation, employer. But if someone is giving you less than $100 and it's in-state contributor, technically you don't need to report their name. You still need to report sort of the aggregate amount of all of those under $100 contributions from various individuals. But you don't have to actually report each individual name contributor. There's like a box on the schedule A1B, and it just essentially has the amount, right? So maybe it's going to be, $300, but that's from, 30 people, and so you're not going to actually have to capture all of that contact information. But again, the committee should always keep records of this. And that's because if you have somebody who's giving you $75 and so they fall under that aggregate and you didn't have to report them individually, but later they give you 50. And so now you're in the same election cycle and you're over $100, you are going to have to report that on a later schedule. So make sure that you just keep track of who's giving you what and when. So tracking small donations, campaigns aren't expected to sort of seek identifying information sort of during, again, there's a lot of events that you're holding sometimes, and it's a little bit hard to kind of keep track of those small dollar amounts. But if you can, like if you're holding some type of event where you're able to sort of capture that information, and maybe you think, oh, I'm going to see these same people again, or maybe they're going to contribute to me again, you may want to go ahead and err on the side of caution and just try to get that information earlier, even though they haven't hit the $100 yet as an in-state contributor. So again, use your best judgment, but I'm always looking at from the perspective of if somebody challenges you or files a complaint against you, what is your best defense, right? And so the more record keeping you have, the better it helps you in the end. Okay, so individual contributions from out of state. So they added a new schedule to correspond to the new law. So any contribution from an out of state individual needs to have that identifying information. So there's no $100 threshold for them. It's any amount. And again, this was just a recent legislative change. Reporting for candidate committees. So like I said, there are certain instances where you can accept monies from another candidate committee, but these are the conditions essentially. It has to be a committee that is essentially disposing of what's called surplus monies, which means they are terminating their committee. They're no longer going to be active as a committee any longer. And so if they're have surplus monies and they have not filed their nomination paperwork, so we're going to use the example of this election cycle for August, right? So your deadlines were in April, right? You had to file your nomination paperwork by April to be on the ballot. If they did not file, so they're not actively running for office this year, and then they have they're in their last year, right, of their term, their existing term, then they can go ahead and make a contribution to you from their surplus monies. And there's something where they can identify that on their schedule. Again, they are still limited to give it you only up to your contribution limit, right? So maybe they have $10,000. Well, they can't give you all of that. They can only give you that $6,550. That is the contribution limit this election cycle. So again, you just want to be careful that if a candidate committee wants to give you monies, that they're meeting all of these requirements, because ultimately, if they aren't, you're going to have to refund this money back. Okay, so a city council member is in the final year of her term, has decided not to run for re-election. They did not file their nomination paperwork, right? So they're not going to be on the ballot. Can they contribute to another candidate's committee? So yes, right, because it meets all the requirements. They're in the final year of the term. Nomination deadline has passed. They didn't file paperwork to be on the ballot. So they can contribute to another candidate committee up to that contribution limit. What if a mayor has 2 years left on their 4-year term and hasn't decided if he's going to run for re-election in 2024 in 2 years? The nomination paperwork deadline is passed and he isn't running for re-election this year. Can he contribute to another candidate's committee? And the answer is no, right? Because while he didn't file nomination paperwork, he didn't have to. He's not in the last year of his term. And so he cannot contribute to another candidate at this time. So for reporting PAC contributions, so other political action contributions, you're just going to want to get the information from them, same identifying information. And then again, you can only accept contributions that are registered with the applicable filing officer. So if a PAC that contributes to a mayoral candidate has to be registered with the city or town clerk prior to making a candidate contribution, right? So you just want to make sure they're actually registered in a jurisdiction before they're actually giving you a contribution. Candidate committees, again, not required to sort of have to investigate, but you do still want to know where your money is coming from. A mega PAC that is going to, remember the mega PACs are the ones that can contribute double the amount, and they have to go through a separate process at the state where they have to show that they have a number of contributors, and then they get sort of for a 4-year cycle, they can actually distribute this extra amount to candidates. A mega PAC that attempts to contribute more than the contribution must provide a copy of its certification, right? So if you get an amount, let's say again, $10,000, and you're like, whoa, that's over my contribution limit. And they say, oh, well, we're a mega PAC, we're allowed to give you up to 13,000. Then you just need to want to ask them for a copy of that certification. That should be easy enough. You might even be able to pull it off at the state, but they should be able to give that to you. Because you're not permitted to obviously accept that unless you have that certification. And then if you're unable to get that from them, again, you just want to make your best efforts. Maybe you want to talk to the Secretary of State's office, try to verify that they're a mega PAC. If not, you're going to want to refund what's over that limit. So next is what is a mega PAC? A mega PAC, again, like I said, it's just certified by the state. They've received a number of contributions from 500 individuals in the amounts of $10 or more. So they're meeting certain thresholds. And so then they're allowed to give at this additional amount. They operate more at the state level. Okay, so reporting political party contributions. So again, this is really only going to apply to Tucson, if at all. So because it's, nonpartisan aren't going to have political party contributions because they can only give to their nominee of their party. So if you're Tucson, I would take a look at this one. So the next is partnership. I know we had a question about partnership. So partnership has to be reflected. So this has to be something that's, designated through their articles of incorporation. They have to have a partnership agreement or other type of document filed with a government entity. This is the information that's required on the schedule, right? So you're going to need this information about how they're officially registered to put that information on the schedule. And again, they're just the regular physical street address and then their corporation commission file number. So this helps you to make sure that they are actually registered with CorpCom. So they can accept a contribution from a general partnership, a limited partnership, a limited liability partnership, or a limited liability limited partnership. So you have a lot of options there. It does not need to be registered with a government agency or domiciled in Arizona, but it does need to have that CorpCom. So a partnership may contribute in its own name, but then it's duly attributed to any participating individual partners. Because again, you as an individual could just give freely independently, right? So if you're doing it through a partnership, then it's being distributed through the partnership. So it does also affect the partnership's contribution limits, along with their own individual contribution limits, because they don't want double dipping essentially. So you have to include, the partnership has to include a written notice with the contribution, identifying the participating partners, along with instructions on how that contribution should be allocated between the partners. Maybe it's not going to be 50-50, maybe it's going to, depending on who's in the partnership. Because once you have that distribution, then that's how, maybe if it's going to affect their individual contribution limits. Okay. And then corporate contributions. We've talked about this a little bit. Candidate committee may not accept contributions from corporations, LLCs, or unions. So if you're a PAC, so that's a political action committee that incorporates only for kind of liability purposes, right? So they're not a corporation in the sense that that's how they're structured, but it's really more for an LLC for liability. They can give you contributions again through a PAC. So just make sure you kind of want to ask some questions. And then also labor organizations, you cannot accept contributions from any of them. All right, personal monies. So again, yes, you can unlimited amount. You're not subject to contribution limits. You can give as much as you want of your personal monies, but you still have to disclose it. And that's where sometimes we see these complaints, because there's a belief that somehow you don't have to disclose it because it's your personal monies, but you do. So you just have to report your information. And then personal monies is a broad definition, right? It's your assets, salary, dividends, bequests, spousal income, gifts, loan proceeds, or family contributions. And all of these are separately defined in the statute. I have it here, 901 section 40. So if you want to take a look to see like how that's categorized. So they are contributions, but they're just not subject to contribution limits. So here's a little bit kind of outlining of a little bit more kind of what I just mentioned. I have it here, and then it's also in statute. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but take a look just so you can get an idea. Trust income, personal gifts, loans, family contributions. Let me go to the Q&A there. So can a candidate loan his company money and pay himself back with contributions? So yes. But a candidate who seeks to fund his or her campaign through a loan must take out the loan in his or her name or their spouse's name, right? Because spouse is sort of included in that personal monies category, and then loan the campaign committee the desired amount of money. The candidate or spouse may require repayment or forgive the loan entirely. If the candidate makes a loan to their campaign, again, this is still contribution, right? You're still contributing. Personal monies for campaign finance reporting purposes. So you should include a memo entry. This is from the candidate handbook. You should include a memo entry of personal loan to properly sort of identify the loan for reporting purposes. So you're going to want to put it under personal monies, but you're going to want to kind of have that extra identifier to help the public know that it's actually a loan, because that means you're expecting it to be paid back to you. So it's good for you to kind of note that early. So refunds, this happens because, again, maybe you took a prohibited contribution and you didn't know at the time and you realized it later, and so you need to refund that money. And so there is a schedule that talks, can list where exactly the refund goes. Also, like if you receive like a contribution that's been earmarked for another candidate, And then an excess contribution that cannot be reattributed. We'll talk about excess contributions next. And then so the total refunds, again, is just subtracted from your contributions received from your summary on that Schedule A. I know it's confusing. It's just sometimes you're just gonna have to look at the form and kind of sort of follow along. So what is reattributing an excess contribution? So this is something that was new with the 2016 law. An excess contribution is just that, right? It exceeds the contribution limits. So a candidate committee is basically given 60 days to remedy that excess by refunding, right? That's always an option. You can just refund the amount. Or if you determine that the contribution is from an individual, you can reattribute that excess to another individual who is on the joint account with that individual. So usually it's spouses, right? So maybe one person has given you an excess and then you can reattribute it. I think I have, yes, next slide, I have an example. So spouse A makes $7,000 contribution to a candidate that uses a check, because again, you have to have an instrument that shows that there's a joint account. So as both spouses as joint account holders, only spouse A signed the check and has not made any previous contributions, right? So it's not signed by both, it's one individual, but it's on an instrument that has joint account holders. The contribution limit, remember, is $6,550. So this is an excess contribution. So within 60 days of receiving that contribution, the candidate or the treasurer can go ahead and contact spouse A and say, hey, I saw this was a joint instrument. Would your spouse be willing to have me reattribute the excess to him or her? And so they can verbally authorize that reattribution. And so then you're going to record it as 6,500 contribution limit from spouse A, right? That's the max. And then a 450 contribution from spouse B. So that's essentially how you do it. And then spouse B still has room to give you more if they want to. So is reattribution limited to joint account holders? Yes. The law only allows it to individuals who are joint account holders. And again, you have to have that sort of instrument that demonstrates they are joint account holders. If it's not, then you have to just refund. So loans, okay, so this is Schedule A2A. So there's several schedules that have to do with loans. And again, this is where I would encourage you to look at the handbook and kind of get an idea of what maybe applies to your particular situation. But it's all the regular information. Anybody who endorses your loan, you would also have to list out. Anyone who pays back a loan. So all of this information is listed on the schedule. And then I have an example here about if an individual provides a $5,000 loan to a candidate committee, and then you have somebody like another friend who offers to guarantee that loan on behalf of the committee, then that also impacts their contribution limits to you. So kind of take a look at sort of this math and this calculation. And then as you decide to committee repays that loan back, their ability to contribute to you goes back up, right? So it's kind of a back and forth. And then loan restrictions, again, they're subject to source restrictions as well. So you can't take, corporate contribution still. Again, you can take financial institutions, even though they are incorporated, you can take a loan from them, from banks, but that's pretty much the exception. And again, just you want to make sure that it's that you're properly tracking it, because it is kind of your personal monies, right? But you might want to be marking it that it's a loan, so that as it goes down, you can properly track it. So forgiveness on loans received, if you receive any type of forgiveness, you're going to want to go ahead and mark that on Schedule A2B. And so again, if you're contributing your unlimited personal monies to your own campaign, you can forgive a loan without restriction. Other people might just be settling a debt, and they might allow you, they can, after 5 years, if you're unable to repay the debt, they can agree to discharge it. And then you can go ahead and consent, and then they can that can be reflected on your report. And then repayment on loans made, and then also interest accrued on loans made. So you're going to see there's a lot of sort of subcategories for all these loans. Just take a quick look at it. If you have to do a loan, I would really encourage you to either get a treasurer who really understands campaign finance law, or seek legal advice, because there just are a lot of hoops to jump through. And then rebates and refunds on A3. So again, you're just basic information. You do want to identify the original transaction, the rebate or refund was received, and then interest accrued on committee money. So if you're, in an account, your monies are in an account that's accruing interest, you do have to report that. And then in-kind contributions. So these are non-monetary benefits, right? Goods and services, anything else of value provided to candidate committee without charge or at less than usual than the normal charge. That's that discount. And so as you see here, I've kind of outlined all the schedules, and it kind of tells you, so it's essentially almost a duplicate of what we've just walked through, right? Of all just the regular contributions. And now you're doing the same thing for in-kind, because those are your monetary, and then your in-kind are all your goods and services. And so this kind of walks you through, it's really the same requirements that apply. It's just for in-kind. So for campaign or finance reporting purposes, this gets really confusing. So receipt of an in-kind contribution cannot affect your cash account. So make sure that when you're filling out your schedules and then you're corresponding to the page 3 and page 4, which is your receipts and your disbursements, that you're putting it in the correct column. You're going to see a cash column and an equity column. So your in-kind should go in that equity, because that really should not affect your balance overall. So just make sure you're putting it in the right column. So again, you're reporting at fair market value, your in-kind contributions, the price it would cost someone else, like your opponent, to purchase that same good or service. And then they have to be equal and normal to the charge received on the date that you received it. And you have to, usually, again, if you don't know, because that's sometimes we're like, well, I don't know how much it costs, just call, you know what I mean? Just start calling, like what would be an estimate or a proposal, or what it would cost for that if you're doing that without it being given to you. So you can get an idea. And then if you receive donated or discounted goods or services, again, it's sort of that difference, right? That discount. So maybe you are paying for it, but maybe you're getting a discount. And so you just want to list that in-kind discount on your form. And this comes into play a lot, I've seen with like signs and print publications that you receive some type of discount. Okay, so if a PAC pays for signs of a candidate, there you go, is this still an in-kind contribution? So yes, the PAC provided goods to the candidate. The candidate must estimate that fair market value of the signs, and they report on the contribution schedule on A5E. So what if the candidate's friend owned the sign shop and gave the PAC a discount on the signs? Is this an in-kind contribution to the candidate? So again, this is maybe likely no, but it is an in-kind contribution for the PAC, right? Because the PAC received a discount. So they should probably report it on theirs as an in-kind contribution on their appropriate schedule. So if my candidate committee receives free computer services, does the service have to be reported as an in-kind contribution? So this depends. It just depends, right? So what are the services? Are they website design, social media, internet access, something else? This is where there's not a lot of guidance. So you're going to have to ask these questions. Is it a non-monetary benefit, right? So is it in-kind? Is it a service? Is it being provided without charge or at less than usual, a normal charge? And if the answer is yes, then it likely does meet the criteria for in-kind contribution, unless it falls into an exemption. And so then you have to look at, remember those exemptions that we went through with contributions of what is not a contribution. If it falls under any one of those, then essentially it is not a contribution. It would not have to be reported, but it's a multi-step process, right? So first you need to just identify what it is. Is it, a good or service? Is it money? Would it normally fall under the definition of contribution, an in-kind contribution? And then if so, does it fall under any of the exemptions? And that kind of helps you figure out whether or not you need to report it. So if a neighbor hosts a fundraiser in their home, do I have to report the in-kind contribution for refreshments? So again, remember the volunteer, maybe hosting something at their home, if they're paying for food and beverages, it's not considered a contribution. So is volunteer activity in-kind contribution? So again, there's kind of a list of what types of volunteer services are not considered contributions. So take a look at that list again, because if they're not contributions, then you don't have to report them. So again, these are ones that we've kind of already talked about, but I go into a little more detail here if you want to look at that later. So determining volunteer activity. So a volunteer's use of email, blogging, social media, or other internet activity does not constitute contributions, as long as, again, they're not paid for by, a volunteer or any other person. They're not paid or reimbursed for such activity. And again, they're not doing something we're doing like paid advertisements for you, right? And honestly, this section is a little messy. There's just not a lot of guidance, and it's not clear. And as more and more people use social media platforms, we do see a lot more complaints in this area, and it's a little difficult to kind of navigate, because we're doing the same analysis that I'm talking about here, right? Is it a contribution? Is there an exemption? And sometimes the facts are a little muddled. And so do your best if you get any of these. If you feel like it's on the bubble, it might just be best to report it. If you feel like, you didn't report it and then you get a complaint, just make sure that you can really defend sort of your decision to hopefully get that complaint dismissed. So, and then I just have an example of volunteer activity. So I'm kind of going to go through these pretty quickly since we're getting towards the end. So just kind of read these. These are supposed to kind of help guide you a little bit more about maybe different things like for volunteer situations that what be considered a contribution versus what isn't. So Q&A here is appearing at a business and in-kind contribution. So again, a candidate's permitted to make campaign-related appearances at outside organizations without the value of that appearance being deemed in kind. But there's criteria that needs to be met. We kind of talked about that, right? The sports stadium and all that. So just kind of look at that to see if that falls into one of those exemptions. And then again, same thing with elected official tours and conferences. It might not be a contribution if these conditions are met. And then the rest of the schedule here, extensions of credit, you just have to put that as long as, and also anything that remains outstanding. Extensions of credit received, so any payments of extensions of credit received, again, you also need to report that. All of this is individually on each schedule, so it kind of walks you through the information that's required. Joint fundraising and shared expenses, so you're just going to want to put all of the regular detail, and then they are permissible, again, as long as there's a written agreement, okay? So you want to make sure that ahead of time, you and another candidate that are having a joint fundraising, that you've already outlined how the monies are going to be distributed. So you're going to want to make sure that's done before you have the fundraiser. And so any checks like made out to both candidates, make sure that it's distributed according to the agreement. You just want to have everything ready to go before the fundraiser. Then other contributions, you'll see these other schedules here, payments for goods and services, receivables and debts owed to the committee, surplus monies in and out. That's if you're terminating your committee and you're going to use your surplus, and then miscellaneous receipts. So anything that maybe doesn't neatly fit into one of the other categories. So I'm going to run through expenditures really quickly, because again, it's kind of just the corresponding, other piece of the contributions. So Schedule B is all of your expenditures. So you're just writing anything and it's going out of the committee, right? Single disbursements over 250 during that reporting period have to be itemized, right? So you want to make sure that you're always reporting the name and address and contact information, the date of the disbursement. Okay, and then Schedule B1 here, yes. So operating expenses, this is probably going to be your largest category. So anything, this is vast majority of your spending, right? So if you have staff or advertising or salaries or rent, utilities, anything like that, it's likely going to fall into your operating expenses here. And then also, if you contribute to other candidate committees, again, this is only allowable as a surplus, right? So same requirements apply to you as they apply to other candidate committees. You can't be running this year. You're not going to be on the ballot. You're in the last year of your term. You're terminating your committee, and so your surplus monies are going up to the contribution limit to another candidate. That's what that schedule's for. Monetary contributions to PACs. If you want to give there, then you're going to ahead and put it on that schedule. Again, political parties. And then partnerships, corporations, LLCs, again, not applicable to candidate committees. And same thing for labor organizations, right? And then refunds of contributions received. So disbursements here of loans, there's a very lengthy list, and we kind of talked about loans already, and it's essentially all the steps. So just take a look at the schedules, take a look at your candidate guide. It's the loans made, if anyone's guaranteed your loan, if there's a forgiveness on a loan, repayment on a loan, interest accrued on the loan. It has a schedule basically for each type of transaction relating to your loan. And then rebates and refunds made. You'd also report that as well. And then we have the same schedule for in-kind, right, that we have for contributions. Same thing for money going out. So for other candidate committees, to PACs, parties, partnerships, anything like that, you would have to report. For Schedule B for 6 through 9, so these are a little different. So these are independent expenditures. Independent expenditures are just that, right? You are not coordinating with whoever it is you're giving the money to. And so I would take a look at the definition here of what an independent expenditure is. Make sure that you actually fit in that category. It's somewhat odd for, I think, a candidate to put something in this category. So make sure that you're actually doing an independent expenditure before you report in that category, because it might just be a regular expenditure. Same thing with ballot measure expenditures. If you're providing your monies to a ballot measure to support or advocate or oppose a measure, then it would need to go in this schedule. If you were in a recall, they have a recall schedule as well. And then again, party nominees, but that does not apply to nonpartisan. So here's a little bit more about IEs, the independent expenditures. I'm not going to read through it, but I would just, again, take a look at it. Make sure you understand that independent expenditures can't have coordination. So if you are coordinating with somebody, like you're providing information, they're in contact with you, that's non-independent expenditure. So make sure that you understand that there can't be any coordination at all. And then there's like a whole list of presumption of coordination. If a campaign finance complaint is filed, what the clerk, filing officer would take a look at. And then also maintaining a firewall. This is if you are trying to make sure that you have an independent expenditure and you're not coordinating. This is what you would take a look at to make sure that those proper protocols are in place, so that it is independent. So other disbursements, Schedule B, kind of 10 through 14. This is where you'd list that joint fundraising. And also it wants your percentage of who gets what, and the joint fundraising event date and that type of shared expense. And then any reimbursements made, accounts payable, again, transfer out of surplus monies, and then miscellaneous disbursements. So they do try to capture everything possible that you might need to report. So can I use committee monies to pay for an election night party? Yes, there is no restriction. You'd probably just report that under an operating expense. If a committee circulates, if a PAC circulates my petitions, is that considered a contribution? It has to be reported. Yes, it's essentially like if it is a contribution if you're paying an individual, PAC, or organization to collect signatures on your petitions. And then there's some penalties for late or incomplete reports. So you are responsible, especially as the chair and the treasurer, mostly the treasurer, but a lot of you are both. You're responsible for filing a timely and complete campaign finance report. Those are the terms, right? So make sure it's on time and it's also complete. If you do not file timely, then you're going to be sent a written notice by the clerk within 5 days of the deadline, notifying you that there's going to be penalties assessed, monetary penalties per day, and that you need to come in and file, basically. Financial penalties accrue until the late report is filed, and then they'll accept your report even if you haven't paid, but essentially that could hurt you later if you don't get that paid. So make sure you always pay that bill. And then if for some reason the committee decides I'm not going to respond or I'm not going to file, the clerk may refer to the committee to the city or town for enforcement, which essentially means they could temporarily suspend your committee and then ultimately permanently suspend your committee. So you can't do any transactions. Because we're running a little bit out of time, I'm going to run really quickly through the next couple sections and we'll take questions at the end here. So for committee transfers, so there are transfers that are allowable between committees. So you can do transfers to the same municipal office, to different municipal office, and then county or to state or legislative, although a direct transfer is prohibited. So we'll have here, let's say for the same office, right? You are permitted as a committee to use funds raised during a prior election cycle for the same office. It's not really a transfer because it's more of a continuation. You've just left your committee open. And then for running for a different office, you can go ahead, you have to follow all laws obviously applicable to, you know, your contributions, expenditures, reporting transfers, but you may transfer funds to a new committee for a different office. So for example, a council member who's opened a committee, they want to run for mayor, right? Because right now they're a council member, they want to run for mayor, and they're forming a separate mayoral office. So you can't sort of raise monies for both in one committee. You have to have the separate because they are separate offices. But transfers of monies are allowed because it's for a different office. So upon transfer, this is where it gets really difficult though. This is where you have to have really good record keeping, because if someone has given you contributions for that candidate, like you can't exceed, right? So again, this is where they're trying to avoid kind of double dipping. So if you've received the maximum contribution of $6,550 to your candidate member council committee, then you can only transfer that to your mayoral committee if that particular individual hasn't already given you that, right? So again, you just need to make sure that they're not trying to put it in this pot over here and this pot over here and then let you transfer and have a double amount. Okay, and then running for a county office, there really is no problem if you want to file, you'll just have a different filing officer. You'll have to go to the county and essentially just register and start reporting with them, but you are allowed to do some transfers to that office. I would probably check with that jurisdiction just to make sure that they don't have anything separate for you to follow. And then the next one is state or legislative office. So local candidates are prohibited from directly transferring committee monies to state or legislative office. You have to park it in a county committee for like 2 years, and then you can move it to a state or legislative office. And part of that reasoning is that state and legislative offices have less, they can accept less money, like 20% less than what a local candidate. So you have 6,550 and they're like 5,000 something, right? They're 20% less. And so what they're trying to avoid is having people sort of form local committees, get all this extra money and then transfer it to a state. So they have this kind of parking requirement here for 2 years into a county committee. And then advertising and disclosure, I wanted to go over this because this happens a lot with campaign finance complaints. So any campaign advertisement or fundraising solicitation by a person other than an individual has to include a disclosure that indicates it was paid for and authorized by the candidate. So for example, a proper disclosure for a candidate would be paid for by Pike for mayor, authorized by Christopher Pike. If the disclosure contains an acronym, nickname that's not commonly known, they should spell that out. And then advertisement is pretty broad. It's information, materials, non-paid social media that are mailed, emailed, posted, etc., as you can kind of see. So it's really quite a lot of types of publications or broadcasts. And then next is disclosure on the fundraising solicitation has to be readable. And there's all these requirements here about what that means, right? So when it's broadcast on a radio, how it has to be spoken, if it's delivered by hand or mail, how it should be readable, what the vertical height of the disclosure should be on that mailing, and then if it's delivered electronically, that it should be readable. And then if it's displayed on a sign or billboard, there's also other requirements. So, and same thing with television or in a video, additional requirements are met. I would just strongly suggest that you take a look at this because this is a complaint we get quite often. And it's usually not so much about, oh, the height was wrong or something like that. It's usually that you failed to put the disclosure on your materials. So just make sure that you, if you can include it, that you do. So this, when a disclosure is not required, so via social media messages, text messages, or messages sent by a short message service, unless it's pre-recorded. And that's partly just because that's such a small block of information, it's hard to add a disclosure. But But essentially, again, if you can, I would do it because this is like one of the #1 campaign finance complaints that are filed. So advertisement that are placed as a paid link on a website, you don't have to include the entire disclosure as long as you have a link to your website that then does have the full disclosure. Same thing about advertisements placed as a graphic or a picture link. So again, if you can link it to your website that has the full disclosure, you'll be in compliance. Again, bumper stickers, pins, anything really small, you would not have to do the disclosure because it's just too small. And then also a published book or documentary or film, you do not have to include the disclosure. But again, probably one of the #1 complaints. So if you can put your paid for by, authorized by, just put it on there. And then terminating a committee, I'm not going to go through this too much just because I think all of you are not in that stage right now, but take a look through all of these. There's really no set date for you to terminate, but there are requirements. And essentially the main requirement is you have to get your balance to 0. So if you have debts, you're going to need to either get those forgiven or paid off. If you have surplus monies, there's only certain ways that you can dispose of those surplus monies. You can't just, put it in your personal account or give it to a friend. I mean, there has to be certain requirements that are met. So just kind of take a look through all those slides. I'm not going to go through them too much. And then enforcement penalties, just be aware that the complaint process is outlined in that state procedures manual, right? And as I mentioned before, it has the force and effect of law. So I've had a lot of clerks placed in a really uncomfortable position where a complaint is filed and then they're getting a lot of frustration and anger directed towards them because they're following the procedure that's outlined in the procedures manual, right? So if they get a complaint, they need to follow the process. They need to be able to provide notice to the complainant, or to the respondent. They need to then allow the complainant, the person who filed the complaint, time to respond. And then they also can give the complainant a reply. So just make sure, there's a lot of back and forth with those notification processes, and they can't just take action. And I think that sometimes frustrates people who file a complaint. They demand that they take the reports down, or they fix something, or they institute penalties right away. The system is designed to provide some due process. And we like that, right? We want to make sure everybody has the chance to defend themselves. So I would say though, that if you file a complaint, make sure that it's clear, right? That you're citing the proper statutes. I've seen a lot of complaints lately that have mislabeled the statutes, right? I don't know if they're using the old set, but they're the wrong statutes. So you want to make sure you're using the current version. It's on the Arizona legislature's website. It's also in the candidate handbooks and the PAC handbook. So make sure that you're actually, and then if you have allegations of something like someone didn't file their disclosure on their advertisement, if you have a copy of that, please submit that along with the complaint. I mean, that type of evidence, it helps the clerk. And then they can provide that to the respondent, give them time to respond. And then if you're the person subject to the complaint and you realize, oh my gosh, I made a mistake, right? I didn't include the disclosure, or maybe I didn't properly report this. See what you can do to fix it. The system is designed for compliance. That's what we want. We want disclosure. So if you can fix it by amending your report, if maybe you took an unlawful contribution from a corporation, then you need to refund it. You know what I mean? And that can be shown on your amended report. So if you can do what you can to help facilitate sort of a dismissal, I think that helps you. However, the clerk is responsible for evaluating all the information and then making a reasonable cause determination. And if they find that there is a reasonable cause that you have violated campaign finance law, they will refer that to enforcement, which means it goes to their city or town attorney, and their city or town attorney has the ability to for subpoenas, for getting more information, and also assessing civil penalties. So you don't really want to get to that stage, right? We want to try to clear this up. If you get a complaint filed against you, do what you can to respond and to fix the situation. I also have seen a few times, which always surprises me, where the person who a complaint is filed against them, they don't actually really provide much of a response to defend themselves. And that's really hard for the clerk, right? They don't have the ability to sort of investigate separately. So if you're not going to defend yourself or provide an explanation of why something wasn't done properly, and all we really have to go on is the actual complaint, well, then it's probably likely that you're going to get referred to enforcement, right? So just help us help you, essentially. Keep that in mind, and just know that, again, they're bound, the clerks are bound by the state procedures manual and state law when it has to process these complaints. So they can't really deviate from that process. So I think that's pretty much it for the campaign finance complaint process. This has all the details essentially of what the process is, and then references, but that's essentially it. So I know that was a lot and I went a little bit over, but I can take questions now.
So, okay. If a candidate loans personal monies to their campaign, not via a loan from a bank, does it need any of the other schedules done other than the personal monies notated as a personal loan? Like no interest or paid back or forgiven?
Right, so that's a good question. So if you personally are loaning to your own committee, sort of, do you need to fill out those other schedules for, forgiveness or payments or loan or interest, anything like that? Probably not. I mean, unless I guess you're charging yourself interest or anything. You're going to want to put that in your personal monies. But again, just keep record keeping on that, right? You can add extra notations on the report form that say this is a loan. And then as you pay it back, because maybe you're getting other contributions and you're paying it back to yourself, then you can go ahead and note that as well. There should be, I think, in the repayment section, you may want to put it there on that schedule, just so that there's some corresponding, factors here that you can see where the money is going. Loans are very complicated. I'm just going to tell you that right now. They're really complicated. There's not a lot of guidance in the manual or in the handbook, but I would still take a look at it. And if you're not sure, just always remember that the best, you want to make sure everything is properly disclosed, right? If you get something in the wrong category and someone challenges you, then we can fix that, right? Or you can fix that if it's brought to your attention. But if you have the information listed and the public knows where the money is going in and out, that is really the purpose of the campaign finance law. So we just want to make sure that all that information is there. So add those extra notations if that's going to help you kind of keep track. But for loans, because I know I had to skip over that pretty quickly, just read over the handbooks really carefully and then take a look at the corresponding statutes. And this is, again, hey, do you have a friend who's a really good accountant, who might be able to help you to kind of understand that, or the best way, or maybe somebody who's a treasurer for other campaigns that maybe you can talk to. What's the best way to report it?
May a candidate as an individual contribute monetary or in kind to a different candidate?
So like your individual okay, so I think the question is, so if you as an individual, can you contribute to another candidate, essentially? Yes. So from your personal, yes. I mean, if it's not connected to your campaign, you are able to, contributions are technically speech. So you are able to go ahead and contribute, you as an individual, separately, as long as it's not connected to your campaign monies. And that's partly why we have that segregation, right? Your personal monies should not be connected to your campaign monies.
If a candidate uses videos on their social media from another candidate with a similar platform, is that an in-kind contribution from the originating candidate's committee, which would be prohibited, or is that just sharing public information?
Okay, so this one's a little complicated. So this is if you have a video that I guess maybe you're sharing from another candidate because you share sort of a similar platform. Is there any type of in-kind contribution? So the way that it's sort of set out in the statute, if you have social media, right, and you're just sort of retweeting something or sharing something, it would not be, right? It's not a contribution. So I guess maybe I'd have to look at, or you'd have to think about, what is the mechanism? Is it much different than how you're doing it on a website? Like, I don't know, I guess, what the mechanisms are for that, right? Are you embedding it? Is there like some technical aspects? Are you having to, what are the extra steps, I guess, that you're doing to see whether or not that actually falls into that exception? I mean, I think if it's pretty similar to social media messaging, where you're just, again, retweeting, forwarding, sharing without any sort of paid advertisements or anything, that's not a contribution. So it seems like it isn't, but I think you'd want to just kind of walk through the steps to see what you're doing to get that onto your own website.
Do you have to put the exact name of your campaign committee on your signs and handouts?
So you should, I would say. So the question is, should you put your campaign committee name on your signs and on all of that? So I would say best practice is yes, right? So if it's, like I said, I've used Pike, right? So Pike for mayor, right? So if that's your name of your campaign committee, then it probably should be that. But I also know that sometimes you get ahead of yourself, you know what I mean, with signs, and maybe you haven't formed your committee yet. So you didn't have that on your signs. But it really should be at least your candidate name, right? Like, so it should be kind of how it's listed in statute. So your name, your office, maybe it's not perfectly identical, but it should still have those components of the paid for and authorized by in order for you to be compliant with the statute.
Does a t-shirt for a candidate have to include a disclosure?
So t-shirts, I don't think usually, I mean, because it has to be something small, right? So like buttons and little things like that don't have the disclosure. I mean, I think if you can fit the disclosure on there, it's always best for you to just do it. But I don't know that we've had a case yet that has said yay or nay, whether or not, because I don't know, I guess with the t-shirt, if there's a design and how much, you know what I mean, whether it would fit, or, if it's only just one line on your t-shirt, maybe you could fit it on the back. I mean, so that's unfortunately pretty fact specific, and we don't have any guidance. I would just say if you can fit it, because the statute is basically allowing the exception for things that are too small, right? The item is too small to adequately fit a disclosure statement. So if you can fit a disclosure statement on something else, that I would suggest you just do it.
Is there a list of qualified campaign finance attorneys anywhere? I found it very difficult to find one in the Tucson area. Which drive much further.
Okay, so are there sort of qualified, sort of, I guess, kind of campaign finance or election attorneys? So there are. Try to think. I mean, in Tucson area specifically, I don't know, but I know that there's a number of attorneys who are based in Phoenix that help, I think, some rural candidates. So I wouldn't see why they probably wouldn't want to, expand out to Tucson. What I can do is, because I actually just went to the state bar election training last week and saw quite a few of my friends there. So, I mean, I can see if maybe we can, if there's a way that the state bar has a list or something like that maybe we can connect to, and I'll get that to Matt so that maybe he can send that out to everyone.
How can I look up the finance reports of opposing candidates?
Okay, so how can you look up campaign finance reports of opposing candidates? Again, all of that is required to be on the website, right, of the city or town. I think sometimes though it's difficult to know where. Sometimes it's on the elections tab if they have one. Other times it might be on sort of like a reports or documents tab. I say the best thing is just call the clerk and just say, hey, where do you have this posted on your website? And then you can access it from there.
How can I determine when my reporting dates are?
Okay, how do you determine your reporting dates? So if you are in the cycle for right now for August, November, so when you look at that cover sheet, it's going to show kind of all the dates there. And again, don't select the local only. That's for special elections. I know that's confusing, but just don't select that one. You're going to see other dates. So like your next reporting date deadline is July 15th. So if you look in that second column on the cover page, there's going to be a date, 2 dates. So it'll be say July 1 through July 15th. That's your next reporting date. And that should help kind of guide you for the next ones that are due, because you're going to have a pre-election report due July 23rd. Then you're going to have another one October 15th. So you'll have a few. You can also see if your clerk, they might have the dates out for you, like just listed. Sometimes they put them on their website. Other times they can just provide you with the list.
Because finance reports are public, if a contributor doesn't want to have their full address public, would I be able to use their email address in that space, or is that a portion of the address? Is there any way to help them with that?
So if a contributor, I guess, wants to keep maybe their street address confidential, and since those reports are public, can they provide some different information? I believe PO boxes are acceptable. If that's an option. If for some reason they're a protected voter or protected, you know what I mean, like they fall under one of the categories, because we have like law enforcement judges, things like that, where their addresses are protected. You could always just put address protected, you know, and if for some reason, if a complaint is filed on that, you know, we could obviously, the clerk's office would work with you on that to verify that, okay, this person is in fact a protected, you know, address holder. But I think that's probably the best option. I would say though, for the most part, the purpose of campaign finance reporting is disclosure. So they actually want to know, I mean, that is the intent. They want to know the name and the address. They want to know who you are. Who is it that's contributing to their candidates?
What is the most violated issue by brand new candidates? What's the most common mistake?
Most common mistake. Well, I say, I give you my top 10 and I see those all pretty frequently. I will say the advertisement one does come up a lot. The advertisement disclosure. I think people just forget, or they don't realize that that applies to them. But it's also easy to fix, right? So like, I think a lot of people get worried about that, but you can always then just go add it, you know what I mean, to your website. If you have certain signs out that don't have it, then you can probably just add like a label or something like that, that provides that disclosure. The other one I would say is accepting in-kind contributions from corporations. I've seen this a number of times where you kind of get it drilled in your head, right? At least I hope you have, not to accept contributions from corporations. But you don't realize it when it comes to in-kind, right? So I've had before where people have gotten discounted signs that are, or actually maybe even free signs, right? And it came from a corporate entity. Because yes, it was a friend that was doing it from them, but the friend didn't list it as a contribution from the friend. It actually came on a corporate, under their corporate account. And that's an in-kind contribution. So you just have to be mindful about, like, if you have friends who are helpful and they're in the business of something that could help your campaign, be clear to them that you can't accept corporate contributions. So is this coming from them as an individual? And most of the time it shouldn't be a problem. I mean, unless they've already maxed out their contribution limit, it can just come from them. But just make sure that it's clear that you're accepting it from individuals and not corporations. I would say that's probably the biggest one, because it's so inadvertent, you just don't realize that that's what you're doing.
So organizations like Act Blue keep a percentage of the donation that is made. How is that reported? Is it reported as a fee or something else?
Okay, so organizations like Act Blue keep a portion of the
Or like GoFundMe.
fees. Oh, or GoFundMe or something like that. So they keep a portion. How is that reported? So, I mean, you're reporting your contributions. So if you know, you're only getting $97 out of 100 that was given to you, then you're getting $97, right? So Act Blue or any of these other organizations, I would assume whoever's keeping the fees would have to report that in their own way. But if you're not receiving that as the contribution, you know what I mean? I think you just have to report what you've received.
If I'm running for a 2-year term for a town council position, if I decide to run for re-election, can I use the same campaign committee, or does it have to be a new one? Because then I'd be serving a 4-year term instead of a 2-year term. Or how does that work?
Okay, let me see. I'm like trying to, okay, so they're currently in a 2-year term?
They're running for a 2-year term, but if
Okay.
they run again 2 years down the line, would that be considered a 4-year term? Or
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So for when you're deciding whether or not like you can keep your committee open, or whether or not you need to form a new one, it's really just about the office. So if you're a council member and like, let's say you're finishing out a term right now, right, of somebody else, and so it's only 2 years, but you want to go ahead and run again in a couple of years for the full 4-year term. If it's the same office, you don't need to sort of close out an account and open a new one, right? It's the office is council member. But if you're a directly elected mayor, city or town, and you're going to run for mayor, that is a different office. So you would have to create a new committee.
Now these two, I'm a little unsure what they mean, but the first one says, is the candidate filing paperwork required to be posted online? So just
Okay, so So posting online requirements, so it's the, what you submit to the clerk, every campaign finance report and statement is required to be online. So that's your statement of organization, and that's your campaign finance reports, and that ultimately will be your termination statement. So again, they don't have a choice. They have to, that's in statute, they have to put that online. So you don't have to put it online. You just give it to the clerk and then they'll post it.
And then I think this is for the reporting. Do we have to have the identification number on every page? Is what it says.
Okay, so for the report, for the identification number, I want to say that the report form, and I have it right here, so let me just take a look. Yes, the committee ID number is on every single page. So yes, you're going to want to do that. And that's just in case, obviously, that something gets, separated, that they'll know what page that goes to.
That's all we have.
Okay, I think that's all the questions then. If anything else comes up, feel free to email, like I said, the league, and they can go ahead and get that to me. Again, I can't really, answer like very fact specific questions because I'm not your attorney. But if it's just general kind of questions, I can at least direct you to the resources. I know this is a lot of information and it's very technical, but I applaud you for being here, for trying to learn it. I would just take probably an extra hour on your part to just kind of, now that this is fresh in your head, to kind of go through the candidate handbook and just kind of review, because that will help you with some of the particulars, especially of sections that we couldn't go into in depth in this time frame, so that you kind of get a better feel for it, and at least you know what questions to ask, right? And then again, you can always ask the clerk questions, just again, know that they can only provide you with general information. And then I will see again about maybe contacting the state bar, see if we can get maybe a list of election attorneys. So that way we can send that out to everybody. But I really thank you for your time, and I hope this was helpful, and good luck.